Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. It was March 2019 when I made what would become the worst decision of my life. As a 23-year-old photography student working on my thesis project about isolated landscapes, the Akala National Forest seemed like the perfect location. The dense 400,000-acre wilderness had always carried whispers of disappearances and unexplained incidents, but I dismissed them as local folklore. The forest's reputation didn't deter me. If anything, it added an element of intrigue to my project. I'd been hiking since I was 12, and my experience gave me a perhaps dangerous level of confidence. I planned a 4-day solo trek, mapping out a route that would take me through some of the most remote sections of the forest. My mother begged me not to go alone. "Thomas," she'd said, her voice cracking with concern, "at least take someone with you." But I was stubborn, convinced that solitude was essential for capturing the raw essence of the wilderness in my photographs. I remember the morning I set out. The air was crisp, carrying that distinct early spring chill that makes your lungs feel clean and sharp. The ranger station was barely staffed. Budget cuts had reduced their presence to a skeleton crew. The lone ranger on duty, a weathered man in his 50s, gave me a long, peculiar look as he processed my backcountry permit. "Stay on the marked trails," he said, tapping my mapped route with a calloused finger. "We've had 3 rescue operations already this year. Cell service is non-existent once you pass Thunder Ridge." He hesitated, then added, "And if you hear anything unusual at night, stay in your tent." I nodded, barely listening, more focused on checking my camera equipment one last time. My pack contained 4 days' worth of supplies, emergency gear, and my precious camera setup. The weight felt reassuring against my shoulders as I started down the main trail. The first few hours were exactly what I'd hoped for. The forest was pristine, untouched. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches creating a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the morning light into ethereal beams. I stopped frequently to photograph, particularly drawn to the way moss draped over fallen logs and the patterns of lichen on weather-worn rocks. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 8 miles and reached my first planned campsite near a small stream. The location was perfect, a flat area sheltered by a natural rock formation with enough clearing to see the stars at night. I set up my tent, arranged my gear, and started preparing dinner while there was still light. That's when I noticed the first oddity. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. In all my years of hiking, I'd never experienced such absolute stillness. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Perhaps a predator in the area had scared off the wildlife. But deep in my gut, something felt wrong. As darkness fell, I retreated to my tent, reviewing the day's photos on my camera's LCD screen. Among the hundreds of shots, one caught my attention. It was a wide-angle landscape, taken about 2 miles back, showing a vast sweep of forest. In the far corner, barely visible, was what appeared to be a figure standing between 2 trees. I zoomed in, but the resolution made the shape too pixelated to make out clearly. I convinced myself it was just a shadow or a trick of light. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the unnatural silence of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd captured something I wasn't meant to see. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind against my tent sent my heart racing. Around 3 a.m., I woke to what sounded like footsteps circling my campsite. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed too heavy to belong to any local wildlife. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as they made 3 complete circuits around my tent. When morning finally came, I found no footprints in the soft earth around my campsite, But the ground was strangely disturbed, as if something had been methodically searching the area. My trail mix, which I'd stored in a bear-proof container, was scattered across the ground, though the container showed no signs of damage. I should have turned back then. Every instinct was screaming at me to return to civilization. But I'd always prided myself on being rational, on finding logical explanations for seemingly inexplicable events. Besides, I told myself, I had a thesis to complete. So I packed up my gear and continued deeper into the Akala National Forest, unaware that I was walking into a nightmare that would forever change my life. The second day started with an unsettling fog that clung to the forest floor, making the trail markers difficult to spot. My GPS device was showing inconsistent readings, which I attributed to the dense canopy overhead. According to my map, I needed to head northwest to reach my next campsite, but something about the terrain wasn't matching my expectations. The humidity was oppressive, causing my clothes to stick to my skin. As I hiked, I noticed increasingly bizarre formations in the trees, sections where all the branches pointed in unnatural directions, as if they'd grown to avoid something. My scientific mind tried to rationalize it as the result of some strange weather pattern or disease, but the formations became more frequent as I pressed deeper into the forest. By midday, I realized I hadn't seen or heard any wildlife for hours. The trees had grown denser, their trunks darker and more twisted. I stopped to check my coordinates and discovered my GPS had stopped working entirely. The compass was spinning erratically, rendering it useless. I was now navigating purely by the sun and my topographical map. Around 3 p.m., I discovered something that made my stomach turn. Half hidden under some fallen leaves was an old backpack, its material rotted and torn. Inside, I found a molded journal, its pages too damaged to read, and a camera similar to mine. The camera's screen was cracked, but when I removed its memory card, I hoped it might still be functional. I set up camp early that day, choosing a spot near a rocky outcropping that offered some protection. As I boiled water for my freeze-dried dinner, I tried to review the found memory card on my laptop. Most files were corrupted, but one image loaded, a blurry nighttime photo showing what appeared to be a human figure standing at an impossible angle, its proportions somehow wrong. The sun set earlier than it should have, the darkness seeming to rise from the ground itself. That night, the silence was broken by a sound I still struggle to describe, like the low hum of power lines mixed with something that might have been singing, but at a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Dawn brought no relief. The fog had thickened, and the air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. My water filter was clogged with an oily black substance I couldn't identify. I had to use my emergency tablets instead, but the water tasted metallic and left my tongue feeling numb. I abandoned my planned route, deciding to head due east toward the highway. But the forest seemed to resist my progress, presenting endless obstacles, fallen trees, sudden ravines, and areas of ground that felt wrong underfoot, as if the earth itself was hollow. By afternoon, I stumbled upon a clearing that wasn't marked on any map. Perfect circles of dead vegetation, each about 20 feet in diameter, formed a geometric pattern across the ground. In the center stood a weather-worn stone marker, its surface covered in what looked like initials and dates carved by different hands. The newest carving was dated just 3 months ago. Below, it was an arrow pointing east and the words, "They follow." The rational part of my mind insisted this was just the work of local teenagers, but the precision of the dead circles and the absolute stillness of the air suggested otherwise. My camera began malfunctioning, taking photos on its own. When I checked the images, they showed strange light artifacts and shadows that didn't match the actual scene. In some photos, the trees appeared to be in different positions than they were in reality. As evening approached, I found what appeared to be an old research station, a small concrete building with boarded windows and a heavy metal door hanging off its hinges. Inside, amidst years of debris and decay, I discovered notebooks filled with coordinates and cryptic observations. One page detailed the migration patterns of local phenomena and included a map marked with dates and times. The building offered shelter, but being inside felt wrong, as if the air was too thick to breathe properly. I set up my tent outside instead, though the clearing around the station offered no comfort. That night, the humming returned, louder than before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I woke to find my camera had taken hundreds of photos while I slept. Each showed the same scene, my tent from different angles, but in some images, there appeared to be shadows moving around it, growing more distinct with each shot. The fourth day brought rain, thick, heavy drops that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The water left faint brown stains on my rain gear and tiny red welts wherever it touched my skin. My electronic equipment began failing systematically. First my phone, then my backup battery pack, and finally my flashlight. I abandoned most of my gear, keeping only water, some food, and my now useless camera. The forest had become a maze of identical trees, each bearing strange markings that looked almost like letters from an unknown alphabet. The ground sloped steadily downward, though according to my topographical map, I should have been climbing. That's when I encountered the first clear evidence that I wasn't alone. Ahead on the trail was a fresh boot print larger than my own, but the impression was reversed, as if someone had walked upside down across the mud. The encounter marked the beginning of what I can only describe as a pursuit. Something began stalking me through the forest. I never saw it directly, but I could sense its presence, always just behind me or just ahead or watching from the trees. The rain continued, but now it fell upward, defying gravity. The trees seemed to shift position when viewed from different angles. I ran until my lungs burned, but distance seemed meaningless. Landmarks I passed would reappear ahead of me, and paths that should have led east somehow brought me back to the same locations. Time lost all meaning. My watch showed impossible hours, its hands spinning randomly. I could no longer tell if I'd been in the forest for days or weeks. The hunger was constant, but I couldn't keep food down. The water I drank tasted increasingly like copper. I began finding pieces of my own equipment scattered along the trail. Equipment I'd abandoned miles behind me. Each item was arranged carefully, forming arrows that pointed deeper into the forest. My camera, which I'd stopped carrying, would appear hanging from branches ahead of me, each time containing new photos I hadn't taken. They found me on the morning of the 7th day. Though I have no memory of the last 48 hours, I was discovered walking along Highway 40, over 30 miles from my last known position, wearing clothes that weren't mine and carrying a camera that contained thousands of photos I couldn't explain. The physical evidence was inconclusive. Blood tests showed no drugs or toxins, though my body displayed signs of extreme stress and exposure. My core temperature was dangerously low despite the warm weather, and my retinas showed burns consistent with exposure to intense light, though I had no memory of any such exposure. The psychological evaluation was more troubling. I exhibited symptoms of extreme post-traumatic stress disorder, temporal displacement, and what the doctors called environmental psychosis. It took months of therapy before I could sleep through the night, and years before I could look at photographs again. I never returned to photography. The thesis project remains unfinished. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear that humming, and my compass still spins wildly when I approach certain wooded areas. The Akala National Forest claimed 16 more hikers in the years following my incident. 3 were found, exhibiting similar symptoms. The others remain missing. The rangers have since closed off the section of forest where I was found. They cite environmental concerns and dangerous terrain, but I've seen the satellite images, perfect circles of dead vegetation, forming patterns that seem to shift and change with each new photograph. I still have the memory card from the rotted backpack. Sometimes I consider trying to recover its data, to see if others encountered what I did. But deep down, I know some questions are better left unanswered. Some territories should remain unexplored. And some stories, like the true nature of what exists in the Akala National Forest, should remain untold. The summer of 2018 started like any other in coastal New South Wales. I was 34 then, working as an environmental consultant, which often took me to remote locations. My wife, a botanist, usually accompanied me on these expeditions, but that day would prove different from our usual outings. The morning began with a light mist hanging over the eucalyptus trees, their leaves releasing that distinct Australian bush scent into the humid air. We had parked our Land Cruiser at the base of the cliff, the GPS marking our location at approximately 100 meters above sea level. The cliff face loomed ahead, not particularly challenging for someone with my climbing experience, but steep enough to demand respect. "I don't like the look of that brush," my wife said, pointing to the dense scrub that choked the narrow trail ahead. She had always been more cautious than me, more attuned to the subtle warnings nature sometimes gives. "The thorns will tear right through these pants." I checked my backpack one last time. Water bottle, protein bars, first aid kit, and my phone for documenting anything interesting we might find. "I'll go ahead and scout it out," I offered. "Maybe there's an easier path around the side." She nodded, settling down on a sun-warmed boulder with her field journal. "Don't be too long, and keep your phone on." The brush was thicker than it appeared from below. Lantana vines grabbed at my clothes, and the native raspberry thorns left thin red lines on my exposed forearms. The humidity intensified as I pushed through, sweat beginning to soak through my shirt. The ground beneath my boots was soft, rich with decades of decomposed vegetation. After about 20 minutes of careful navigation, the vegetation suddenly thinned. I emerged into a clearing that stopped me in my tracks. The sight before me was so unexpected, so out of place, that for a moment I wondered if the heat was causing me to hallucinate. Spread across the clearing, covering every inch of ground, were shells, thousands upon thousands of them, bleached white by countless years of sun exposure. They formed a carpet of calcium carbonate that crunched softly under my boots. Most were bivalves, what looked like oysters and mussels, but there were other varieties too, spiral shells, cone shells, and fragments of what might have been crab carapaces. The location made no sense. We were 100 meters above the ocean, in an area that showed no signs of recent geological uplift. These shells hadn't been carried here by natural processes. They had been deliberately accumulated. I pulled out my phone and started recording, panning slowly across the extraordinary scene. The sunlight reflected off the white surfaces, creating an almost ethereal glow. The shells seemed to stretch to the edge of the clearing, disappearing into the undergrowth like a frozen tide. As I moved deeper into the clearing, I spotted a particularly perfect specimen. It was a large oyster shell, completely intact, its inner surface still bearing a faint pearlescent sheen. Without thinking, I picked it up and slipped it into my pocket. That's when everything changed. The change was instantaneous. The warm summer air vanished, replaced by a penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. My skin prickled, and my breath started forming visible clouds in front of my face. The temperature drop was dramatic, scientifically impossible for a summer afternoon, yet I was experiencing it. Standing in that clearing, surrounded by thousands of ancient shells, I became acutely aware of every sound. The whisper of leaves, the distant cry of a currawong, and something else, a silence that felt heavy, watchful. The clearing no longer felt empty. Instead, it seemed crowded, as though I stood in a room full of people just beyond my peripheral vision. My rational mind struggled to process these sensations. I'm trained to observe and document environmental phenomena, to find logical explanations for natural occurrences. But nothing in my scientific background could explain the overwhelming sense of presence that enveloped me. The feeling intensified. It was like being watched by hundreds of eyes, all focused intently on my every movement. My heart rate accelerated, and sweat began to freeze on my skin. The primal part of my brain, the ancient survival mechanism we all carry, screamed danger. With trembling fingers, I reached into my pocket and withdrew the shell. Its surface, which had seemed so invitingly smooth moments before, now felt wrong against my skin. I placed it carefully back among its companions, trying to remember exactly where I'd found it. The moment the shell left my hand, the atmosphere shifted again. The temperature didn't immediately return to normal, but the sense of hostile presence diminished slightly. I began backing away, keeping my eyes on the shell-covered ground. Every step crunched loudly in the unnatural quiet. As I reached the edge of the clearing, my heel caught on a root, and I stumbled slightly. The movement caused my phone to slip from my pocket, clattering onto the shells. When I bent to retrieve it, I noticed something I'd missed before. Beneath the top layer of shells were bones. Small ones, mostly fish and animal remains, but their presence added a new dimension of understanding to what I was seeing. Back home that evening, I sat at my computer, my hands still shaking slightly as I typed Shell Middens Australia into the search bar. The results confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. I had stumbled upon an Aboriginal midden, a sacred site where generations of indigenous people had discarded the remains of their meals and conducted ceremonies. These sites were more than just ancient garbage dumps. They were living historical records, places of profound cultural significance. Many middens dated back thousands of years, containing not just food remains, but tools, weapons, and sometimes human remains. They were protected by law, and disturbing them was a serious offense. As I read deeper into the archaeological literature, I learned about the spiritual significance of these sites. Many indigenous communities considered them places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. They were locations where the present touched the past, where the ancestors remained close. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that clearing. In my mind, the shells whispered against each other, moved by unseen forces. The dreams, when they came, were vivid and unsettling. I dreamed of the clearing as it might have been centuries ago, filled with people gathering, eating, living. But these weren't peaceful scenes. They were fragmented visions of life and death, of ceremonies I couldn't comprehend, of blood on shells and smoke rising into ancient skies. I woke repeatedly, drenched in sweat despite the air conditioning. Each time the room felt different, colder, occupied. Once I could have sworn I heard the soft crunch of shells under invisible feet. 3 days passed, but the experience wouldn't leave me. My wife noticed my distraction, the dark circles under my eyes. Finally, I knew what I had to do. The drive back to the cliff base seemed longer this time. It was early morning when I arrived, the sun just beginning to burn through the coastal fog. The path through the lantana seemed to have grown more tangled, more resistant to my passage. This time, I carried nothing but an offering of native flowers and a small bag of ochre, purchased from an indigenous art supply store. A local elder I'd consulted had suggested these as appropriate gifts of respect. The clearing looked different in the morning light. The shells seemed less white, more yellow-grey like old bone. The silence was still there, but it felt expectant rather than hostile. The soft glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the still waters of the canal, creating an eerie mirror image of the world above. It was late October 2022, and at 28 years old, I had fallen into a routine that felt both comforting and slightly unsettling. Every night, without fail, I would embark on my solitary journey along the canal path, convinced that the cool night air and the rhythmic sound of my footsteps were the perfect antidote to the day's stresses. My name is Michael, and I've always been drawn to the tranquility of nighttime. There's something about the way the world seems to hold its breath after dark, as if waiting for something to happen. Living in a quaint town on the outskirts of Manchester, I had grown accustomed to the safety and predictability of my surroundings. The canal path, with its carefully maintained walkways and ornamental bridges, had become my sanctuary. As I stepped out of my modest flat that fateful night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air felt heavier, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I dismissed it as nothing more than the onset of winter, the changing of seasons playing tricks on my senses. The first part of my walk was always the same. I would pass by Mrs. Thornbury's house, her cats watching me from the window with their luminous eyes. Then came the old willow tree, its branches reaching out over the water like gnarled fingers. I had walked this path so many times that I could navigate it blindfolded. Every crack in the pavement and every loose stone etched into my memory. But tonight, as I approached the first bridge, something caught my attention. Two men, their voices carrying across the still night air, were speaking loudly in German. In our small English town, hearing a foreign language spoken so boldly was unusual enough to make me take notice. They were tall, both wearing identical caps, with a design I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. I slowed my pace, trying to appear casual as I observed them. They seemed to be in their early 30s, their builds solid and intimidating. As I drew closer, their conversation abruptly ceased, and I felt their eyes lock onto me. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickened my steps, suddenly eager to reach the small convenience store that marked the halfway point of my usual route. The sound of heavy footsteps behind me grew louder, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. The two men had changed direction and were now following me, their pace matching mine. My heart began to race, and I could feel beads of sweat forming on my forehead despite the cool night air. As I approached the road crossing that led to the store, I was forced to stop and wait for the traffic to clear. The men caught up with me, and I braced myself for confrontation. But to my surprise and relief, they simply crossed the road without stopping, heading straight for the store I had intended to visit. I stood there for a moment, my pulse gradually slowing as I watched them disappear into the fluorescent-lit interior of the shop. Had I overreacted? Was my anxiety playing tricks on me again? I shook my head, trying to clear the paranoid thoughts that had begun to cloud my judgment. Deciding to forego my usual snack run, I turned back towards the canal path. The encounter had left me unsettled, and I was eager to lose myself in the familiar comfort of my nightly walk. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few moments, half expecting to see the two men following me again. The canal stretched out before me, a ribbon of inky blackness reflecting the stars above. I tried to focus on the beauty of the scene, on the peacefulness that had drawn me to these nightly walks in the first place. But something had changed. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. Every rustle of leaves and every distant sound made me flinch. As I approached the bridge where I had first encountered the men, I felt a growing sense of unease. The archway loomed before me, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow all light. I paused, my feet refusing to carry me forward into that impenetrable blackness. And then I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But as I stood there, frozen in place, the sound came again. Words in German, spoken in hushed tones, emanating from the shadows beneath the bridge. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Were the men waiting for me? Had they somehow known I would return this way? The logical part of my brain tried to assert itself, insisting that there must be a rational explanation. But in that moment, logic seemed a feeble defense against the primal fear that had taken hold of me. I took a step backward, then another, my eyes never leaving the mouth of the bridge. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, and I could have sworn I saw movement in the shadows. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and I knew I had to make a decision. Fight or flight, the most basic of instincts. And in that moment, with my heart pounding in my chest and adrenaline coursing through my veins, I chose flight. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as I fled back the way I had come. The sound of my own ragged breathing filled my ears, drowning out whatever horrors might have been lurking behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my flat, slamming the door behind me and collapsing against it, gasping for air. As I sat there on the floor, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The world I thought I knew, the safe and predictable routine I had built for myself, had been shattered in the space of a single evening. The following day dawned grey and overcast, perfectly matching my mood. I had barely slept, tossing and turning as my mind replayed the events of the previous night in an endless loop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figures beneath the bridge, heard the whispered German words that had sent me fleeing into the night. I went through the motions of my daily routine, but everything felt off-kilter. The world seemed muted somehow, as if I was viewing it through a veil. My co-workers at the small accounting firm where I worked noticed my distraction, but I brushed off their concerns with vague excuses about a poor night's sleep. As the day wore on, I found myself obsessively checking the local news websites, half expecting to see reports of some terrible incident along the canal. But there was nothing, just the usual mundane stories of local council meetings and minor traffic accidents. The normalcy of it all was almost more unsettling than if there had been some confirmation of the danger I had sensed. By the time evening rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves. The thought of my nightly walk filled me with dread, but at the same time I felt an inexplicable pull towards the canal. I needed to know if what I had experienced was real or if my imagination had simply run wild. With trembling hands, I laced up my walking shoes and stepped out into the gathering darkness. The air was thick with moisture, a fine mist hanging low over the ground and muffling the usual sounds of the neighborhood. As I made my way towards the canal path, every shadow seemed to conceal a potential threat. I approached the first bridge cautiously, my senses on high alert. The area was deserted, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the canal banks. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me as I realized there was no sign of the mysterious men from the night before. Emboldened by the apparent normalcy of the scene, I continued my walk. But as I progressed further along the path, the feeling of being watched intensified. The mist seemed to thicken, swirling around my feet and obscuring the way ahead. More than once, I thought I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The second bridge loomed ahead, and I felt my steps falter. This was where I had heard the whispers, where the shadows had seemed to come alive. As I drew closer, the mist parted slightly, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, etched into the stonework of the bridge, was a symbol. It looked ancient, a series of interconnected lines and curves that seemed to shift and change as I stared at it. I had walked this path hundreds of times and had never noticed it before. How was that possible? I approached cautiously, drawn by a morbid curiosity. As I reached out to touch the symbol, a voice behind me made me jump. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." I spun around, my heart pounding. An old man stood a few feet away, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. His face was deeply lined, his eyes sunken but sharp as they regarded me. "Well, what?" I stammered, trying to regain my composure. The old man nodded towards the symbol. "That there's old magic. Best left alone, it is." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a senile old man. But after what I had experienced the night before, I found myself hanging on his every word. "What do you mean, old magic?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man shuffled closer, his eyes darting around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "This canal, it's older than you think. Used to be all sorts of strange goings-on here back in the day. People disappearing, strange lights in the night. Some say there's a whole other world hidden just beneath the surface." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But that's just stories, right? Folk tales?" The old man fixed me with a penetrating stare. Is it now? Tell me, young man, have you seen anything unusual lately? I hesitated, unsure whether to confide in this stranger, but something in his manner, in the knowing look in his eyes, compelled me to speak. Last night, I began, the words tumbling out in a rush. There were these two men. They followed me, and then I heard whispers under the bridge. In German. The old man nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "They're back, then," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Who's back?" I asked, a note of desperation creeping into my voice. But the old man was already turning away, shuffling back the way he had come. "Be careful, lad," he called over his shoulder. "And whatever you do, don't follow the whispers." I stood there for a long moment, staring after him as he disappeared into the mist. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as the ravings of a madman, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth to his words. As I turned back towards the bridge, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. The symbol I had seen etched into the stonework was gone, the surface smooth and unmarked, as if it had never been there at all. I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my grip on reality? With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the bridge's surface. Nothing, no symbol, no markings of any kind. Just weathered stone, unremarkable in every way. I let out a strangled laugh, the sound echoing eerily in the misty air. This was madness. I needed to get home, to surround myself with the familiar and the safe. But as I turned to leave, a gust of wind carried a sound that made me freeze in my tracks. Whispers, faint but unmistakable, coming from beneath the bridge. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But something held me there, a morbid curiosity that I couldn't quite shake. The old man's warning echoed in my mind, "Don't follow the whispers." But even as I thought it, I found myself taking a step towards the bridge. Then another. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could almost make out words now, though in a language I didn't understand. I stood at the edge of the bridge, peering into the darkness beneath. The mist swirled and eddied, forming shapes that seemed almost human for a moment before dissolving back into formlessness. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened in the oppressive silence that followed. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then so suddenly it made me jump, a hand emerged from the darkness. Pale and slender, it beckoned to me, fingers curling in invitation. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination, a trick of the light and mist. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, the hand retreated back into the shadows, and the whispers resumed, more urgent now. Fight or flight kicked in once again, and this time flight won out decisively. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise I was making or the curious stares of the few people I passed on my headlong flight home. All I knew was that I needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever madness was unfolding along the canal. As I slammed my flat door behind me and engaged every lock, I realized that my quiet, predictable life had been irrevocably changed. The canal, once a source of peace and comfort, had become a place of terror and mystery, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of whatever dark journey I had unwittingly embarked upon. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. I called in sick to work, unable to face the mundane realities of spreadsheets and client meetings when my world had been turned upside down. Instead, I spent hours scouring the internet for any information I could find about the canal's history, about strange occurrences in the area, about anything that might explain what I had experienced. Most of what I found was useless. Local history websites talking about the canal's construction in the 18th century, its role in the Industrial Revolution, and its eventual decline and restoration as a recreational waterway. Nothing about disappearances, strange lights, or whispers in the night. But then, buried deep in an obscure forum dedicated to local folklore, I found a thread that made my blood run cold. A user going by the name Canal Watcher had posted a series of entries over the course of several months, describing experiences eerily similar to my own. OCT 15. Heard whispers again tonight, getting louder. Think they're trying to tell me something. Nov 3. Saw the symbol on the bridge. When I went back with the camera, it was gone. Am I going mad? Deck 20. They're getting bolder. Saw a hand reaching out from under the bridge. God help me. I almost took it. The posts continued, growing more frantic and disjointed. The final entry, dated just a week ago, simply read, "I'm going in. If I don't come back, tell my story." I sat back from my computer, my mind reeling. This couldn't be a coincidence. Someone else had seen and heard the same things I had. But what did it mean? What was happening along the canal? As night fell, I found myself drawn once again to the window, staring out at the darkened street. The pull of the canal was almost physical, a tugging sensation in my chest that I couldn't ignore. Despite every rational thought screaming at me to stay inside, to call the police, to do anything but go back there, I found myself reaching for my coat. The night was cold and clear, the earlier mists having dissipated to reveal a sky studded with stars. As I made my way towards the canal, I felt like I was moving in a dream, my feet carrying me forward of their own accord. The path was deserted, the only sound, the gentle lapping of water against the canal banks. I approached the bridge where I'd seen the symbol, half expecting to find it there again. But the stonework remained stubbornly blank, giving no hint of the strangeness I had witnessed. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to turn back, to return to the safety of my flat, and pretend that none of this had ever happened. But a larger part, the part that had always been drawn to the mysteries of the night, urged me onward. As I stepped into the shadow of the bridge, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me. The darkness beneath the arch was almost absolute, swallowing the feeble light from the distant street lamps. And then I heard it. The whispers. They started softly at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. But as I stood there, frozen in place, they grew louder, more insistent. The words were still in German, but there was an urgency to them now that I hadn't noticed before. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something held me there. A morbid curiosity that I couldn't quite shake. Slowly, hesitantly, I took a step forward into the darkness. The whispers grew louder still, and I could almost make out individual words now. Though I didn't understand German, the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. Another step and another. The darkness seemed to press in around me, thick and oppressive. I fumbled for my phone, intending to use its flashlight, but my fingers were numb with cold and fear. The device slipped from my grasp, clattering to the ground. As I bent to retrieve it, my hand brushed against something cold and smooth. Not the rough concrete of the path, but something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. I recoiled, stumbling backward. In the faint light that filtered in from the canal, I saw what I had touched. A hand, pale and slender, reaching out from a patch of absolute darkness that seemed to defy the laws of physics. A scream built in my throat, but before I could release it, the hand retreated, disappearing back into the impossible darkness. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, no longer pleading but demanding. "Come," they seemed to say. "Join us." I turned to run, but found my path blocked. Two figures stood at the mouth of the bridge, their features obscured by the backlighting from the distant street lamps. But I recognized the caps they wore, the same ones I had seen on the German-speaking men days before. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" One of the figures took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away. My heel caught on something, a loose stone perhaps, and I felt myself falling backward. Time seemed to slow. I saw the figure reach out as if to catch me. I saw the patch of darkness behind me, yawning wide like a hungry mouth. And I saw, just for a moment, faces in that darkness. Dozens of them, pale and drawn, their eyes filled with a mixture of longing and despair. Then I was falling, tumbling into that impossible void. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was a voice, speaking in heavily accented English. "Welcome home, Michael." I awoke to the sound of dripping water and the smell of damp stone. For a moment I lay still, trying to orient myself. My head throbbed, and every muscle in my body ached as if I'd run a marathon. Slowly, cautiously, I opened my eyes. I found myself in a large, cavernous space, dimly lit by what appeared to be bioluminescent fungi growing along the walls. The air was thick and heavy, with an underlying scent that I couldn't quite place, something ancient and slightly sweet. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I began to make out more details of my surroundings. The floor beneath me was smooth stone, worn by countless years of water and foot traffic. Arched tunnels branched off in various directions, their depths lost in shadow. I sat up gingerly, wincing at the pain that shot through my body. As I did so, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. My clothes were different. Instead of the jeans and coat I had been wearing, I was now dressed in what appeared to be rough-spun linen, dyed a deep indigo. "He's awake," a voice said, startling me. I whirled around to see a figure emerging from one of the shadowy tunnels. As they stepped into the dim light, I saw that it was a woman, perhaps in her mid-40s. Her hair was long and silver, her eyes a startling shade of violet. She wore clothing similar to mine, but with intricate patterns embroidered along the hem and sleeves. "Where am I?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. "What is this place?" The woman regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and what might have been pity. "You are in Unterstadt," she said, her accent thick, but her English clear. "The city beneath the city." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to have settled over my thoughts. "That's impossible. There's no city under Manchester. It's just canals and sewers and—" My voice trailed off as I took in more of my surroundings. This was no sewer or abandoned underground structure. The architecture, what I could see of it, was unlike anything I had ever encountered. Organic curves blended seamlessly with geometric precision, creating spaces that seemed to defy conventional physics. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Your world is not the only one, Michael. There are spaces between spaces, realities that exist in the cracks and shadows of what you think you know." I struggled to my feet, fighting against a wave of dizziness. "How do you know my name? Who are you? What do you want with me?" She held up a hand as if to stem the flood of questions. "I am Ilara. Well, I suppose you might call me a guardian of sorts. As for what we want with you—" She paused, her violet eyes seeming to look through me rather than at me. "That remains to be seen." Before I could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the cavern. 2 men appeared, and with a jolt of recognition, I realized they were the same ones I had seen on the canal path. Up close, I could see that they were identical twins, their features sharp and angular. "Is he ready?" one of them asked Ilara, not bothering to look at me. She shook her head. "He's only just awakened. Give him time to adjust." The other twin snorted derisively. "We don't have time for coddling. The convergence approaches, and we need to know if he's the one." I held up my hands, feeling overwhelmed and increasingly frustrated. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but I want to go home, now." All 3 of them turned to look at me, their expressions a mixture of amusement and something darker, more calculating. Ilara stepped forward, placing a hand on my arm. Her touch was ice cold. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, Michael. You've crossed a threshold that few ever do. Going back, well, it's not impossible, but it's far from easy." I jerked away from her touch, anger replacing my fear and confusion. "I don't care how difficult it is. I want to leave. You can't keep me here against my will." One of the twins, I couldn't tell which, laughed a harsh, grating sound. Against your will? Oh, you naive little surface dweller. You've been making your way here for years. Every night, walk along the canal, every moment spent staring into the darkness. You've been calling to us as surely as we've been calling to you. I shook my head vehemently, refusing to accept what he was saying. No, that's not true. I don't belong here. This is all some kind of mistake. Ilara's expression softened slightly. I know this is difficult to accept, Michael, but you must try to understand. Unterstadt exists in a state of flux, connected to your world but separate from it. We need people like you, those who can bridge the gap between realities. But why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What's so important about bridging realities? The twins exchanged a glance, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross their faces. It was Ilara who answered, her voice low and urgent. Because the barriers between worlds are weakening, she said. The convergence, a time when realities bleed into one another, is approaching. And if we don't find a way to stabilize the connections between our world and yours, both could be destroyed. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. It all sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, and yet, hadn't I just fallen through darkness into an impossible underground city? Who was I to say what was and wasn't possible anymore? So what do you want from me? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Ilara smiled, and this time there was a hint of warmth in it. For now, we want you to learn, to understand, and perhaps, in time, to help us save both our worlds. As she spoke, I became aware of a low humming sound, barely perceptible at first, but growing stronger by the moment. The air seemed to thicken, and motes of light began to dance around us, swirling in complex patterns. The convergence, one of the twins muttered, his eyes widening. It's starting. Ilara grabbed my arm, her grip painfully tight. We're out of time, she said, her voice urgent. Michael, you must make a choice. Stay and help us or try to return to your world. But know this, if you go back now, you may never find your way here again. I stood there, frozen in indecision. The humming had grown to a roar, and the dancing lights were now so bright they were almost blinding. I thought of my life above, my job, my flat, the quiet predictability of it all. And I thought of the mysteries that surrounded me here, the impossible city and its even more impossible inhabitants. In that moment, as reality itself seemed to waver around me, I made my choice. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the fear and uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm me. I'll stay, I said, my voice barely audible over the growing roar of the convergence. I'll help you. Ilara's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with something that might have been approval. A wise choice, she said, her grip on my arm loosening slightly. But not an easy one. Come, we must move quickly. She began to lead me towards one of the arched tunnels, the twins falling into step behind us. As we moved, I noticed that the stone beneath our feet was vibrating, a subtle tremor that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing moment. What's happening? I asked, having to raise my voice to be heard over the increasing cacophony. One of the twins, I still couldn't tell them apart, answered, The convergence is accelerating. Realities are beginning to bleed into one another. We need to reach the nexus chamber before the barriers weaken too much. We hurried through a maze of tunnels, each one seeming to defy the laws of physics more than the last. Some curved at impossible angles, while others seemed to stretch on infinitely, despite the limited space they should have occupied. The bioluminescent fungi grew more abundant as we descended, casting everything in an eerie, shifting light. As we ran, I began to catch glimpses of other beings. Some looked human, or nearly so. Others were so alien that my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. They flitted at the edges of my vision, there and gone in an instant, like half-remembered dreams. Finally, we emerged into a vast circular chamber. At its center stood a structure that defied description, a swirling vortex of energy contained within a framework of what looked like living crystal. Pulses of light raced along its surface, and I could feel waves of power emanating from it, making the hair on my arms stand on end. "The Nexus," Ilara said, a note of reverence in her voice. "The heart of Unterstadt and the focal point of the convergence." As we approached, I saw that there were others gathered around the Nexus. Some I recognized as human, or at least human-like. Others were clearly not of our world, beings of living shadow, creatures that seemed to be made of pure light. Entities that hurt my eyes to look at directly. One of them, a tall, willowy figure with skin like polished obsidian, stepped forward. "Ilara," it said, its voice resonating in my mind rather than my ears. "You've brought the Bridgewalker. Good. We have little time." Ilara nodded, then turned to me. "Michael, this is Zathrak, one of the eldest. He will guide you through what comes next." Before I could ask what exactly was coming next, Zathrak reached out and placed a hand, or what I assumed was a hand, on my forehead. Instantly, my mind was flooded with images and sensations, knowledge pouring into me faster than I could process it. I saw the history of Unterstadt stretching back millennia. I saw the first convergence, when realities first began to bleed into one another. I saw the creation of the Nexus, a desperate attempt to stabilize the connections between worlds. And I saw what would happen if we failed. Worlds collapsing into one another, realities shattering like glass. The very fabric of existence unraveling. As suddenly as it had begun, the flood of information ceased. I staggered, nearly falling, but Ilara's steady hand kept me upright. "What? What was that?" I gasped, my head pounding. Zathrak's featureless face somehow managed to convey concern. "Apologies, Bridgewalker. There was no time for a gentler transfer. You now possess the knowledge you need to assist us." I shook my head, trying to clear it. The information was there, just below the surface of my thoughts, but it was like trying to recall a dream, slippery and elusive. "I don't understand," I said. "What am I supposed to do?" Ilara stepped forward, her violet eyes intense. "You are a bridge, Michael. A connection between your world and ours. With your help, we can stabilize the Nexus and prevent the convergence from tearing reality apart." One of the twins, I now knew their names were Castor and Pollux, spoke up. "But it won't be easy. The process will be painful and dangerous." I swallowed hard, fear threatening to overwhelm me again. But beneath it I felt something else stirring, a sense of purpose, of rightness. This was why I had been drawn to the canal all those nights. This was what I had been searching for without even knowing it. "Tell me what to do," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Zathrak gestured towards the Nexus. "You must enter the vortex. Your presence there, straddling realities, will allow us to anchor the connections between worlds." I stared at the swirling energy, my newfound knowledge telling me exactly how dangerous this would be. There was a very real chance I wouldn't survive the process. But as I looked around at the gathered beings, human and otherwise, I knew I had no choice. This was bigger than me, bigger than any one world or reality. Taking a deep breath, I stepped towards the Nexus. The energy crackled around me, making my skin tingle and my vision blur. "Remember," Ilara called out, her voice seeming to come from very far away. "Focus on your connections, to your world, to ours, to every reality you can sense. You are the bridge. You are the anchor." With one final glance back at the strange assembly, I stepped into the vortex. Pain exploded through every nerve in my body. I felt myself being pulled in 1,000 directions at once, my very essence stretched to the breaking point. Realities flashed before my eyes, worlds of endless ocean, of crystalline spires, of sentient gases swirling through the void of space. Through it all, I clung to the knowledge Zathrak had given me. I focused on the connections, on the delicate web that linked all of existence together. I felt myself becoming part of that web, a living conduit between realities. Time lost all meaning. I could have been in the vortex for seconds or centuries, but slowly, agonizingly, I felt the chaotic energies begin to stabilize. The violent lurching between realities smoothed out. becoming a gentle ebb and flow. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when I was sure I would be torn apart by the cosmic forces surging through me, everything stopped. I found myself back in the chamber, collapsed on the cold stone floor. Every part of me ached, and my vision swam as I tried to focus on the faces peering down at me. Did it work? I managed to croak out. Ilara knelt beside me, a smile of relief and wonder on her face. Yes, Michael. It worked. You've done it. The convergence has been stabilized. As the implications of her words sank in, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. But beneath it was something else, a sense of connection, of belonging that I had never experienced before. It was as if I could feel the pulse of countless realities thrumming through me, a cosmic heartbeat that resonated with my very being. Zathrak's resonant voice filled my mind. You have done well, Bridgewalker. The convergence has been averted for now, but your journey is far from over. I struggled to sit up, every movement sending ripples of pain through my body. What do you mean? I asked, my voice hoarse and weak. Ilara helped me to my feet, her touch gentle but firm. The stabilization you've achieved is temporary, she explained. The forces that drive the convergence are still at work. We must learn to maintain this balance, to strengthen the connections between realities. As she spoke, I became aware of subtle changes in my perception. The chamber seemed more vivid, more real than before. I could sense the intricate web of energies that connected everything around me, from the living crystal of the Nexus to the very air we breathed. Castor, or was it Pollux, stepped forward. You're changing, he said, his tone a mixture of awe and concern. The Nexus has left its mark on you. I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see some visible transformation. While they appeared unchanged, I could feel a new power thrumming beneath my skin, a connection to something vast and incomprehensible. What's happening to me? I asked, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. Zathrak's featureless face somehow managed to convey compassion. You have become more than you were, Bridgewalker. Your experiences in the Nexus have awakened latent abilities, potentials that exist in all humans but rarely manifest. The implications of this were staggering. I thought back to my quiet life above, my mundane job and predictable routines. How could I ever return to that after what I had experienced here? As if reading my thoughts, Ilara placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. You don't have to decide anything right now, Michael. Rest, recover. There will be time for questions and decisions later. I nodded, suddenly aware of how utterly exhausted I was. The adrenaline that had carried me through the ordeal was fading, leaving me drained and shaky. Ilara led me to a small alcove off the main chamber, where a simple bed had been prepared. As I sank onto it, gratefully allowing my battered body to relax, I couldn't help but ask one more question. What happens now? Ilara's violet eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of hope and determination. Now we begin to truly understand the nature of our connected realities. And you, Michael, will play a crucial role in that understanding. As sleep began to claim me, I caught fragments of conversation from the others in the chamber. They spoke of tests and training, of expeditions to other realities, of the need to prepare for future convergences. But underlying it all was a sense of cautious optimism, a feeling that we had taken the first steps towards something monumental. My last conscious thought before drifting off was a realization that my life had irrevocably changed. The quiet canal walks of my past seemed like a distant dream now, replaced by the promise of exploring the very fabric of reality itself. I awoke to the soft glow of bioluminescent fungi, their pale light casting intricate shadows across the curved walls of my small chamber. For a moment, I lay still, trying to convince myself that the events of the past day, or was it days, had been nothing more than a vivid dream. But as I sat up, wincing at the lingering ache in my muscles, I knew that everything had been real. The impossible city of Unterstadt, the convergence, my role in stabilizing the connections between realities. It had all happened. As if summoned by my thoughts, Ilara appeared at the entrance to the alcove. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her violet eyes studying me intently. I took a moment to assess myself. The bone-deep exhaustion had faded, replaced by a strange, tingling energy that seemed to dance just beneath my skin. "Different," I finally replied. Like I'm more aware of everything around me." Ilara nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "That's to be expected. Your experience in the Nexus has awakened abilities that were dormant within you. It's time we began to explore the extent of those abilities." She led me back to the main chamber, which was now largely empty, save for Zathrak and the twins, Castor and Pollux. The Nexus still pulsed at the center of the room, but its energies seemed calmer now, more controlled. "We'll start with something simple," Ilara said, gesturing for me to stand in front of the Nexus. "Close your eyes and reach out with your senses. Tell me what you perceive." I did as she instructed, closing my eyes and trying to focus on the strange new awareness I had been feeling since awakening. At first, there was nothing but darkness and the sound of my own breathing. But then gradually I began to sense something. It was like seeing without eyes, feeling without touch. I could perceive the energy flowing through the Nexus, branching out in countless directions. I saw, or rather felt, the connections between our reality and others, delicate strands of possibility stretching into infinity. "I can see everything," I breathed, my eyes still closed. "The connections between realities, the flow of energy. It's beautiful." When I opened my eyes, I found all four of my companions staring at me with varying degrees of surprise and approval. "Remarkable." Zathrak's voice resonated in my mind. "You've taken to this faster than we anticipated." Castor, or Pollux, I still couldn't tell them apart, stepped forward. "Let's see how far we can push this," he said, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "Try to focus on a specific reality. See if you can glimpse what's happening there." I closed my eyes again, this time concentrating on one of the myriad connections I could sense emanating from the Nexus. As I focused, the strand seemed to thicken, becoming more substantial. Suddenly I was no longer in the chamber. I found myself standing on a beach of purple sand, twin suns setting on the horizon. Creatures that looked like a cross between birds and fish soared through the air, their scales glittering in the fading light. In the distance, I could see a city of spiraling towers that seemed to be grown rather than built. As quickly as the vision had come, it faded, leaving me gasping and disoriented back in the Nexus chamber. "What did you see?" Ilara asked urgently. I described the alien world in as much detail as I could remember. As I spoke, I noticed the twins exchanging meaningful glances. "That's impossible," Pollux muttered. "He shouldn't be able to perceive that level of detail, not without years of training." Zathrak's mental voice was thoughtful. "Perhaps not impossible, but certainly unexpected. It seems our new Bridgewalker has a natural affinity for this work." Over the next few hours, we continued to explore the extent of my newfound abilities. I learned to manipulate the energy flows around me, creating small pockets of altered reality within the chamber. I practiced moving small objects with my mind, though this proved far more difficult than sensing other realities. But it wasn't all exhilarating discoveries. As we pushed the limits of what I could do, I began to experience side effects. Headaches that felt like my skull was being split open. Moments of sensory overload where every sound, every touch became unbearable. Once, I inadvertently opened a small rift to another reality, and it took the combined efforts of Ilara and the twins to close it before anything could come through. As the session drew to a close, I slumped against a wall, physically and mentally exhausted. "Is it always going to be like this?" I asked, rubbing my temples in a futile attempt to ease the pounding in my head. Ilara's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Your abilities will grow stronger with practice, and you'll learn to control them better. But yes, this work will always be demanding. The stakes are too high for it to be otherwise." I nodded. understanding the truth of her words, even as I wondered if I was truly up to the task ahead. Zathrak moved closer, his presence a cool balm against my frayed nerves. "You have shown great potential, Bridgewalker, but potential alone is not enough. You must learn to harness these abilities, to use them with precision and care. The fate of countless realities may one day depend on your skills." The weight of that responsibility settled over me like a physical thing. I thought of the world I had left behind, my job, my friends, the simple pleasures of a quiet life. Part of me longed to return to that simplicity. But a larger part, the part that had always felt like something was missing, knew that I could never go back. Not completely. "I understand," I said, meeting Zathrak's featureless gaze. "I'm ready to learn, whatever it takes." Ilara smiled, a hint of pride in her violet eyes. "Good, because your real training begins tomorrow. Get some rest, Michael. You're going to need it." As I made my way back to my small chamber, my mind raced with the implications of everything I had learned and experienced. I was no longer just Michael, the quiet accountant who took solitary walks along the canal. I was a bridgewalker, a guardian of the delicate balance between realities. The path ahead would be difficult, perhaps even dangerous. But as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for as long as I could remember. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them, for the sake of my world and all the others that now depended on me. The next few weeks passed in a blur of intense training and mind-bending revelations. Each day brought new challenges as I struggled to master my awakened abilities under the watchful eyes of Ilara, Zathrak, and the twins. I learned to create and manipulate small pockets of altered reality, bending the laws of physics within confined spaces. I practiced reaching out to other realities, honing my ability to perceive and interact with worlds beyond our own. And perhaps most importantly, I began to understand the intricate web of connections that linked all of existence together. But it wasn't all esoteric training. Castor and Pollux insisted on physical conditioning as well, pushing my body to its limits with grueling exercises that left me aching and exhausted. "A strong mind requires a strong body," they would say, ignoring my protests as they put me through yet another punishing routine. Through it all, I found myself changing in ways both subtle and profound. My senses seemed sharper, my reflexes quicker. I began to perceive layers of reality that had always been there, but had remained hidden from my previous limited awareness. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I could swear I felt the pulse of countless worlds, beating in time with my own heart. It was during one of these quiet moments, as I sat meditating near the Nexus, that Ilara approached me with news that sent a jolt of excitement and fear through my body. "It's time," she said simply. "The Council has decided you're ready for your first real test." I stood, trying to calm the sudden flutter of nerves in my stomach. "What kind of test?" Ilara's expression was grave. "We've detected a disturbance in a nearby reality. Nothing too severe, but significant enough to require intervention. You'll be going in to assess the situation and, if possible, resolve it." The implications of what she was saying hit me like a physical blow. "You mean I'll be traveling to another reality?" "Physically." She nodded. "It's not without risk, but we believe you're prepared. Castor and Pollux will accompany you as backup, but this is your mission, Michael. It's time to put your training into practice." As we made our way to a smaller chamber adjacent to the Nexus room, Ilara briefed me on the situation. The reality in question was similar to our own, but with subtle differences. A small town in what corresponded to the American Midwest was experiencing temporal anomalies, objects appearing out of time, people reporting memories that didn't match recorded history. Your job is to locate the source of these anomalies and stabilize the local reality, Ilara explained. Remember your training, trust your instincts, and above all, be careful. The laws of physics may not work quite the way you're used to. We entered the chamber to find Zathrak and the twins waiting for us. A shimmering portal hung in the air, its edges flickering with barely contained energy. Zathrak's mental voice filled my mind. Remember, Bridgewalker, you carry a piece of the Nexus within you now. Use it wisely, and it will guide you through whatever challenges you may face. I nodded, swallowing hard as I approached the portal. Gaster and Pollux flanked me, their expressions unreadable. "Ready?" Pollux asked, a hint of challenge in his voice. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead. "Ready?" With that, we stepped through the portal and into another world. The transition was jarring, a moment of utter disorientation as reality seemed to twist and fold around us. Then suddenly, we were standing on a quiet street in what looked like a typical small American town. But even at first glance, I could tell something was off. The sky had a strange greenish tinge to it. Cars parked along the street were a mishmash of styles, some looking like they belonged in the 1950s, while others appeared futuristic. And the people, some walked by in modern clothing, while others wore outfits that wouldn't have looked out of place a century ago. "Well," Castor muttered, "this is going to be interesting." I closed my eyes, reaching out with my newly honed senses. Immediately I could feel the wrongness permeating this reality. It was like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious symphony, jarring and out of place. "This way," I said, my eyes snapping open as I pointed down the street. "The disturbance is strongest in that direction." As we made our way through the town, the temporal anomalies became more pronounced. We passed a house that seemed to flicker between different architectural styles, its appearance changing every few seconds. A group of children played with toys that hadn't been invented yet, while their parents looked on, dressed in clothes from the 1920s. Finally, we arrived at what appeared to be the town square. At its center stood a statue of a man I didn't recognize. But it was what was happening around the statue that caught my attention. A swirling vortex of temporal energy surrounded the monument, pulling in objects and even people from different time periods. As we watched, a Model T Ford materialized out of thin air, narrowly missing a group of startled onlookers. "That's the source," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But what's causing it?" The humidity pressed against my skin like a damp cloth as I watched my husband pack our weathered SUV. August in Georgia can be merciless, turning even the simplest outdoor activity into an endurance test. Our 6-year-old son bounced around the driveway, his excitement making the air feel a bit more bearable. We'd grown tired of the standard campgrounds, those perfectly manicured spaces where RVs lined up like suburban houses, and the wilderness felt more like a carefully curated garden. My husband had heard about this abandoned site from a co-worker who described it with an odd mix of nostalgia and warning. The place had been shuttered years ago, left to return to its natural state. "It's completely isolated," he'd said over dinner the previous night. "No permits needed. Just pure nature." I remember pausing, fork halfway to my mouth, studying his expression. There was something in his eyes, that gleam of adventure that had first drawn me to him 15 years ago. The drive took us through increasingly remote areas, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to dirt paths, barely wide enough for our vehicle. The trees grew denser, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into strange patterns on our windshield. Our son had fallen quiet in the back seat, his usual chatter replaced by wide-eyed observation of the deepening wilderness. The abandoned check-in booth appeared like a sentinel from another time. Its weathered wood had turned a deep grey, nature slowly reclaiming it with creeping vines and moss. The rusted chain across the entrance gate seemed to whisper warnings we chose to ignore. "We'll have to walk from here," my husband announced, pulling the car onto a patch of relatively flat ground near the tree line. The moment he cut the engine, the silence descended, that peculiar quiet that seems to hum with its own energy. I stepped out, and immediately the moisture in the air clung to my skin. The woods felt different here, older somehow. The trees weren't arranged in the orderly fashion of managed forests. They grew at odd angles, their branches reaching toward each other like grasping fingers. Our son grabbed his small backpack, attempting to mimic his father's purposeful movements. Something about his innocent enthusiasm made me hesitate. I found myself staring at the shadows between the trees, trying to convince myself that the unease crawling up my spine was just the natural apprehension of a mother venturing into unfamiliar territory. The path leading into the campground was barely visible, nature having worked diligently to erase human presence. As we gathered our supplies, I noticed how the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, creating dark pockets that seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of my eye. "Ready?" my husband asked, shouldering the heaviest pack. Our son nodded eagerly, but I found myself taking one last look at our car, our final connection to the outside world. The forest seemed to loom closer, its darkness deepening as we prepared to step into its embrace. I didn't know then how that simple decision, to seek something more authentic, more adventurous, would forever change us. The abandoned campground waited ahead, its secrets still hidden in the gathering dusk of that muggy Georgia afternoon. The trek into the campground revealed the slow decay of human order. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground inches deep, muffling our footsteps in layers of decomposition. Our son pointed excitedly at each discovery: rusted fire pits emerging from tangles of kudzu, picnic tables warped by years of exposure, their surfaces hosting colonies of moss and fungi. The deeper we walked, the more apparent it became that nature had been busy during the site's abandonment. Tree roots had buckled the once paved pathways, creating treacherous ridges and valleys. I watched our son navigate these obstacles, his small hands occasionally reaching out to steady himself against tree trunks slick with moisture. The pond appeared through the trees like a dark mirror, its surface unnaturally still in the late afternoon light. No waterfowl disturbed its surface, no fish broke the water, just an expanse of black glass reflecting the increasingly dramatic sky. Something about its stillness made me want to look away, but I couldn't quite explain why. "This spot looks perfect," my husband announced, gesturing to a relatively flat area about 50 feet from the water's edge. The remnants of an old campsite were still visible, a fire pit ringed with stones, a half-rotted wooden bench almost completely consumed by vegetation. Setting up camp felt like disturbing something that had been at rest for too long. Each tent stake we drove into the ground seemed to send subtle vibrations through the earth. The sound of our hammer against metal echoed strangely, as if the woods were catching the noise and playing with it before letting it fade. As evening approached, the humidity began to settle into a heavy blanket around us. Our son helped gather kindling, though I noticed he stayed closer to the campsite than usual, his normal adventurous spirit somewhat subdued. We built a fire that seemed to struggle against the moisture in the air, its flames casting writhing shadows that danced across the surrounding trees. The sun's descent brought rapid darkness, not the gradual twilight of civilization, but an almost sudden plunge into blackness. The tree canopy above filtered out what little ambient light might have reached us, creating a darkness so complete it felt physical. Our son's exhaustion finally overcame his unease, and he crawled into the tent, falling asleep almost immediately. I watched the steady rise and fall of his chest through the mesh window, envying his innocent surrender to sleep. My husband and I sat by the fire, speaking in low voices that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The silence of the place was wrong somehow, not the peaceful quiet of nature, but an absence of sound that felt deliberate, watchful. Castor stepped forward, his eyes narrowed as he studied the vortex. Some kind of temporal rift, but I've never seen one this stable before. It should have torn this reality apart by now. I focused my senses on the statue, trying to pierce through the swirling energies. As I did, I felt a resonance, a familiar pulse that echoed the energy of the Nexus. "There's something in the statue," I said, certainty filling my voice. "A fragment of something powerful. It's acting like an anchor, keeping the rift from expanding further." Pollux nodded grimly. "Good catch. But how do we close it without destabilizing the entire reality?" I took a deep breath, centering myself as I had been taught. I think I can do it, but I'll need your help to channel the energy." The twins exchanged a look, then nodded in unison. "Tell us what you need," Castor said. I explained my plan quickly, aware that every moment we delayed risked further damage to this reality. The twins took up positions on either side of me, their hands outstretched towards the vortex. Closing my eyes, I reached out with my mind, connecting to the fragment within the statue. I could feel its power, raw and untamed, threatening to tear reality apart. But I could also sense its potential for healing, for mending the torn fabric of this world. Drawing on everything I had learned, I began to weave the chaotic energies into a more coherent pattern. It was like trying to reshape a tornado with my bare hands, every motion threatening to overwhelm me. But slowly, painstakingly, I began to make progress. Through it all, I could feel Castor and Pollux lending me their strength, helping to channel and direct the massive forces I was manipulating. Sweat poured down my face, and my entire body trembled. As I channeled the chaotic energies, I felt the strain on my body and mind intensifying. The process of stabilizing a temporal rift is not unlike trying to smooth out wrinkles in fabric, except the fabric is reality itself, and the wrinkles are tears in space-time. To better understand this, imagine time as a river flowing in one direction. A temporal rift is like a whirlpool in this river, pulling in elements from different points in the timeline. My task was to calm this whirlpool, allowing the river of time to flow smoothly once more. The fragment in the statue acted as an anchor point, much like a rock in a stream creates an eddy. By connecting to this anchor and redirecting the energy flow, I could gradually reduce the rift's intensity. This required immense concentration and precise control over the energies involved. As I worked, I could feel the reality around us beginning to stabilize. The flickering object settled into a single time period, and the greenish tinge faded from the sky. The process was exhausting, but with the twins' support, I persevered. Finally, with a sound like a thunderclap, the rift closed. The surge of energy knocked us off our feet, and for a moment, everything went dark. When I came to, Castor and Pollux were helping me up. The town square looked normal, or at least what passed for normal in this reality. The statue stood undamaged, its hidden power now dormant. "You did it," Pollux said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Not bad for your first field mission." The humidity pressed against my skin like a damp cloth as I watched my husband pack our weathered SUV. August in Georgia can be merciless, turning even the simplest outdoor activity into an endurance test. Our 6-year-old son bounced around the driveway, his excitement making the air feel a bit more bearable. We'd grown tired of the standard campgrounds, those perfectly manicured spaces where RVs lined up like suburban houses, and the wilderness felt more like a carefully curated garden. My husband had heard about this abandoned site from a co-worker who described it with an odd mix of nostalgia and warning. The place had been shuttered years ago, left to return to its natural state. "It's completely isolated," he'd said over dinner the previous night. "No permits needed. Just pure nature." I remember pausing, fork halfway to my mouth, studying his expression. There was something in his eyes, that gleam of adventure that had first drawn me to him 15 years ago. The drive took us through increasingly remote areas, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to dirt paths, barely wide enough for our vehicle. The trees grew denser, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into strange patterns on our windshield. Our son had fallen quiet in the back seat, his usual chatter replaced by wide-eyed observation of the deepening wilderness. The abandoned check-in booth appeared like a sentinel from another time. Its weathered wood had turned a deep grey, nature slowly reclaiming it with creeping vines and moss. The rusted chain across the entrance gate seemed to whisper warnings we chose to ignore. "We'll have to walk from here," my husband announced, pulling the car onto a patch of relatively flat ground near the tree line. The moment he cut the engine, the silence descended, that peculiar quiet that seems to hum with its own energy. I stepped out, and immediately the moisture in the air clung to my skin. The woods felt different here, older somehow. The trees weren't arranged in the orderly fashion of managed forests. They grew at odd angles, their branches reaching toward each other like grasping fingers. Our son grabbed his small backpack, attempting to mimic his father's purposeful movements. Something about his innocent enthusiasm made me hesitate. I found myself staring at the shadows between the trees, trying to convince myself that the unease crawling up my spine was just the natural apprehension of a mother venturing into unfamiliar territory. The path leading into the campground was barely visible, nature having worked diligently to erase human presence. As we gathered our supplies, I noticed how the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, creating dark pockets that seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of my eye. "Ready?" my husband asked, shouldering the heaviest pack. Our son nodded eagerly, but I found myself taking one last look at our car, our final connection to the outside world. The forest seemed to loom closer, its darkness deepening as we prepared to step into its embrace. I didn't know then how that simple decision, to seek something more authentic, more adventurous, would forever change us. The abandoned campground waited ahead, its secrets still hidden in the gathering dusk of that muggy Georgia afternoon. The trek into the campground revealed the slow decay of human order. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground inches deep, muffling our footsteps in layers of decomposition. Our son pointed excitedly at each discovery, rusted fire pits emerging from tangles of kudzu, picnic tables warped by years of exposure, their surfaces hosting colonies of moss and fungi. The deeper we walked, the more apparent it became that nature had been busy during the site's abandonment. Tree roots had buckled the once paved pathways, creating treacherous ridges and valleys. I watched our son navigate these obstacles, his small hands occasionally reaching out to steady himself against tree trunks slick with moisture. The pond appeared through the trees like a dark mirror, its surface unnaturally still in the late afternoon light. No waterfowl disturbed its surface, no fish broke the water, just an expanse of black glass reflecting the increasingly dramatic sky. Something about its stillness made me want to look away, but I couldn't quite explain why. "This spot looks perfect," my husband announced, gesturing to a relatively flat area about 50 feet from the water's edge. The remnants of an old campsite were still visible, a fire pit ringed with stones, a half-rotted wooden bench almost completely consumed by vegetation. Setting up camp felt like disturbing something that had been at rest for too long. Each tent stake we drove into the ground seemed to send subtle vibrations through the earth. The sound of our hammer against metal echoed strangely, as if the woods were catching the noise and playing with it before letting it fade. As evening approached, the humidity began to settle into a heavy blanket around us. Our son helped gather kindling, though I noticed he stayed closer to the campsite than usual, his normal adventurous spirit somewhat subdued. We built a fire that seemed to struggle against the moisture in the air, its flames casting writhing shadows that danced across the surrounding trees. The sun's descent brought rapid darkness, not the gradual twilight of civilization, but an almost sudden plunge into blackness. The tree canopy above filtered out what little ambient light might have reached us, creating a darkness so complete it felt physical. Our son's exhaustion finally overcame his unease, and he crawled into the tent, falling asleep almost immediately. I watched the steady rise and fall of his chest through the mesh window, envying his innocent surrender to sleep My husband and I sat by the fire, speaking in low voices that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The silence of the place was wrong somehow. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but an absence of sound that felt deliberate, watchful. The first indication that something was amiss came not as a sound, but as a pressure change, as if the air itself had suddenly become denser. Then we heard them, 6 distinct heavy footsteps emerging from the water's edge. The sound was unmistakably bipedal, water splashing with each deliberate step onto shore. The noise carried the weight of something massive, something that had no business being in these woods. My husband's reaction told me everything I needed to know. In 15 years of marriage, I'd never seen him move with such instinctive fear. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand finding mine in the darkness, squeezing with an intensity that spoke volumes. We raised our flashlights in unison, the beams cutting through the darkness like solid things. The light revealed nothing but trees and undergrowth, yet the presence we felt was undeniable. The air had become thick, almost difficult to breathe. I wanted to call out, to demand identification from whatever stood in the darkness, but my voice caught in my throat. The silence that followed those footsteps was absolute. No retreat, no advance, just a waiting presence that seemed to fill the entire forest. Then the trees began their terrible dance. The sound of breaking branches erupted above us, a cacophony of snaps and cracks that defied natural explanation. Our flashlight beams darted frantically from tree to tree, revealing nothing but empty branches, shuddering with impossible movement. The noise surrounded us completely, moving with a speed and precision that no animal could achieve. One moment it would come from directly overhead, the next from 50 yards away, then simultaneously from multiple directions. The progression wasn't random. It felt orchestrated, intentional, like a performance designed to demonstrate power and control. The water in the pond began to splash and churn, though our lights revealed no cause for the disturbance. The sounds formed a pattern, tree branches cracking, water splashing, heavy footsteps in the underbrush, creating a circular symphony of terror around our campsite. I felt my mind struggling to process what was happening. Everything I knew about wildlife, about natural phenomena, about what was possible in our world, seemed inadequate to explain the events unfolding around us. The presence, whatever it was, demonstrated an intelligence that felt ancient and alien. Our son stirred in the tent, and I felt a primal surge of maternal protection. Moving as one, my husband and I backed toward the tent, our lights still sweeping the darkness. The sounds followed our movement, adjusting their pattern to maintain the circle around us. Inside the tent, we huddled around our sleeping child. The thin fabric walls felt absurdly inadequate against whatever stalked the darkness outside. Hours passed like years as we listened to the continuing cacophony, each sound a reminder of our complete vulnerability. The entity seemed to take pleasure in demonstrating its impossible abilities, moving from ground to treetop in seconds, appearing simultaneously in locations hundreds of feet apart, creating sounds that defied physical laws. Yet it never showed itself, never fully revealed its nature. The first hint of daylight brought an abrupt end to our ordeal. The sounds ceased as suddenly as they had begun, leaving behind a silence that felt almost as oppressive. We waited, straining our ears for any indication that the entity remained, but heard only the gradual return of normal forest sounds, birds beginning their morning songs, small animals rustling in the undergrowth. Our son awoke refreshed, unaware of the night's events. We waited until full daylight before emerging from the tent, our bodies stiff from hours of tense immobility. The campsite looked deceptively normal in the morning light, showing no signs of the previous night's disturbance. Drawn by a mixture of fear and curiosity, we approached the water's edge. The pond's surface was again mirror-smooth, betraying no evidence of the violent disturbances we'd heard. But at the water's edge, we found something that confirmed the reality of our experience. The fallen tree trunk lay partially in the water, its surface mutilated by deep, methodical gouges. These weren't the random marks of weather or wildlife. They were precise, patterned, and fresh. The cuts penetrated deep into the wood, their edges still sharp and white, unmarked by exposure. The pattern suggested intelligence and purpose, though its meaning remained obscure. We abandoned our campsite with as much speed as dignity would allow, leaving behind the heavier items in our haste to return to civilization. The walk back to our car felt longer than before. Each step measured against the possibility that daylight might not be enough to keep at bay whatever had terrorized us. The drive home passed in near silence, each of us processing the experience in our own way. Our son chatted about the camping trip, his memories unclouded by supernatural terror, while my husband and I exchanged knowing glances in the rearview mirror. In the years since that night, I've researched extensively, seeking any explanation for what we encountered. I've read about every known species in Georgia's forests, every documented paranormal phenomenon, every possible natural explanation for what we experienced. None of it comes close to explaining the systematic terror we endured. The abandoned campground remains there, I assume, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Sometimes I'm tempted to return, to seek answers to the questions that still haunt my thoughts. But then, I remember the sound of those footsteps emerging from the water, the impossible movement through the trees, and the deliberate way we were surrounded and toyed with. Some places are abandoned for a reason. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. But in the darkest hours of night, when sleep eludes me, I still hear the echoes of those sounds and wonder what ancient thing we disturbed in those forgotten woods. Winter had started to creep across Maryland when I first drove up the winding mountain road toward what would become my sanctuary. At 72, looking back through the lens of 5 decades, every detail of that journey remains etched in my consciousness with startling clarity. The year was 1970, and the world seemed to be crumbling beneath my feet. The steering wheel felt cold under my fingers as I navigated the narrow roads outside Frederick. Their trees stretched toward a pewter sky, their branches weaving patterns that seemed to mock the disorder of my own existence. 2 months prior, I had walked out of my college classes, unable to focus as my father's death consumed my thoughts. His passing hadn't been peaceful. Cancer had ravaged him slowly, methodically, until the man who taught me to fish and read was reduced to a hollow shell of agony. The inheritance money sat heavy in my bank account, blood money that I couldn't bring myself to touch until I found the advertisement for the cabin. It was tucked away in the classified section of the Frederick News Post, 3 rooms of solitude nestled against the edge of the municipal forest. The rental agreement was simple, handled through a weathered real estate agent who seemed relieved to find any tenant willing to occupy the space during the off-season. The cabin materialized through the trees like an afterthought of civilization. Weather-beaten boards had faded to the color of old bones, and the small front porch sagged slightly to the left. A fallen maple leaf had wedged itself between the boards of the front step, its crimson surface stark against the weathered wood. The key turned with surprising ease in the lock, as if the cabin had been waiting. Inside, the air hung thick with the musty sweetness of disuse. The main room housed a pot-bellied stove, its black surface reflecting weak afternoon light from 2 windows that faced the deeply wooded yard. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom barely large enough for a single bed and dresser, while the kitchen contained the basics: a refrigerator that hummed uncertainly, a 4-burner stove with 1 broken knob, and cabinets that creaked with every touch. The real estate agent had mentioned something about a phone line, but if it existed, I couldn't find evidence of it. The radio I'd brought would have to serve as my connection to the outside world, along with the stack of books I'd accumulated from the Frederick County Library. The silence pressed against my eardrums as I unpacked, broken only by the subtle shifting of the cabin's frame and the distant calls of winter birds. That first night, I sat in darkness on the front porch, watching my breath form clouds in the cold air. The spotlight mounted above the door cast a harsh circle of illumination onto the front yard, creating deep shadows among the surrounding trees. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, its darkness almost liquid in its completeness. The isolation was exactly what I needed. Each morning, I woke to frost patterns on the windows and the gentle tapping of branches against the roof. My days fell into a rhythm of reading, writing in my journal, and taking long walks through the municipal forest. The state park loomed just up the hill, its trails merging with countless unmarked paths that wound through the wilderness. Sometimes, in those early weeks, I would catch myself speaking aloud, if only to hear a human voice break the perpetual silence. The words would hang in the air like smoke, quickly dissipating into the hungry quiet. I began to understand why ancient peoples believed in forest spirits. In such profound solitude, the mind creates movement in shadows, finds patterns in randomness, seeks connection in the void. The residents down the lane, an elderly couple who had lived in these woods since before the war, occasionally invited me for coffee. Their conversations centered around the changing landscape of Western Maryland, how development crept closer each year like an approaching tide. But here, in our forgotten corner of the mountains, time seemed to move differently, flowing like cold molasses through days unmarked by modern convenience. I wrote long letters to my mother, describing the peace I'd found in this primitive existence. The truth was more complex. Beneath the surface calm, grief and confusion still churned like underground streams. But the forest offered a peculiar kind of therapy. Its indifference to human suffering was somehow comforting, a reminder that my pain was temporary against the backdrop of ancient trees and eternal seasons. Then, one bitter morning in my second month at the cabin, everything changed. The scratch at my door was so faint I almost dismissed it as another branch in the wind. But when I opened the door, I found myself staring into the soft brown eyes of a female beagle, her tail wagging tentatively as she gazed up at me with an expression that would alter the course of my mountain solitude. The appearance of this unexpected companion marked the beginning of something I couldn't yet comprehend, a series of events that would challenge my understanding of isolation, humanity, and the thin line between civilization and wilderness. Looking back now, I wonder if I should have recognized it as an omen. But at that moment, I simply saw a lost dog seeking shelter, unaware that we were both about to become part of something far stranger than either of us could imagine. The beagle's arrival changed the texture of my solitude. She possessed none of the sleek hunting prowess her breed was known for. Instead, she bumbled through life with an endearing clumsiness that made training impossible. After a week of failed attempts to teach her basic commands, I settled for simply calling her Dog. She responded to anything spoken in a gentle tone. Winter deepened around the cabin. Dog's paw prints created meandering patterns in the frost each morning as she investigated the perimeter of our shared territory. She slept at the foot of my bed, her steady breathing providing a counterpoint to the settling noises of the old cabin. Her presence filled spaces I hadn't realized were empty. The first awareness of another presence came gradually, like the slow seep of water through stone. Initially, it manifested as a subtle wrongness in the forest's rhythm, moments when the birds would fall silent without cause, or when dead leaves would rustle against the natural flow of wind. Dog noticed too, her head lifting at sounds I couldn't hear, her eyes tracking movement beyond my perception. During my third month at the cabin, I was reading by lamplight when I experienced the first definitive incident. A shadow passed across the window, too tall for a deer, too deliberate for a branch. Dog, usually vocal about wildlife, remained silent but alert, her eyes fixed on the glass with unusual intensity. The darkness beyond the window seemed to thicken, as if something was gathering the night around itself, like a cloak. My walks to visit the elderly couple down the lane became exercises in hyper-awareness. The forest, once a sanctuary, developed new dimensions of mystery. Footsteps would mirror mine from within the tree line, not the sharp crack of breaking twigs, but the purposeful placement of feet that understood the terrain. When I walked faster, they accelerated. When I slowed, they matched my pace. One evening, my younger brother arrived for a visit. A recent engineering graduate, he prided himself on rational explanation. Yet by his second night, the color had drained from his face as he described something keeping pace with him through the woods during his evening cigarette. "It's like it's studying us," he whispered, his hands trembling as he lit another cigarette. The municipal forest stretched vast and ancient around us, hiding abandoned hunting cabins and forgotten trails beneath its canopy. During our daily explorations, Dog and I discovered increasing evidence of human presence in places too remote for casual visitors. Fresh ashes in crude fire pits, food wrappers that hadn't yet surrendered their colors to weather, makeshift shelters constructed with unexpected skill. These sites bore the markings of someone who understood woodland survival, yet lacked the organized efficiency of experienced hunters. Tin cans opened with crude tools lay scattered near beds of flattened grass. Branches had been woven into temporary roofs, displaying both primitive expertise and desperate innovation. Strangely, I felt no fear during these discoveries. The presence that watched us seemed to emanate curiosity rather than malice. Sometimes, in the depths of night, I would hear movement on the porch, careful, measured steps that spoke of awareness and intent. Dog would raise her head, but her tail would wag slightly, suggesting recognition rather than alarm. Our observer became a third resident of the cabin, unseen but undeniably present. The elderly couple down the lane noticed changes too, items rearranged on their porch, peculiar sounds in their garden at night. We spoke about it over coffee, their weathered faces showing concern but not surprise. As if the forest periodically hosted such mysteries, the winter woods held their secrets close, revealing them only in fragments, a glimpse of movement at dusk, the sensation of being studied through the trees, the persistent feeling that we were part of something larger than our own isolation. Dog and I settled into this new reality, our days measured not just by sunlight and shadow, but by the subtle signs of our invisible companion. Looking back from the perspective of age, I recognize this period as the calm before transformation. The presence was establishing itself, learning our patterns, becoming entwined with our daily existence. We had become part of its territory, though we didn't yet understand the implications of this incorporation. The true nature of our situation would soon reveal itself in ways that would challenge everything I thought I knew about solitude, sanity, and the thin membrane between civilization and wilderness. The transformation from watcher to active participant occurred on a February morning, crystalline with cold. At the bottom of the front steps lay a cardinal, its red feathers brilliant against the frost-whitened ground. The bird's placement was deliberate, centered perfectly on the lowest step, its wings folded with unnatural precision. Dog approached the offering with unusual hesitation, her normal scavenging instinct subdued by something in the presentation. I disposed of the bird in the dense underbrush, trying to rationalize it as the work of a local cat. But cats don't arrange their kills with such ritualistic care. This marked the beginning of a progression that defied simple explanation. The gifts appeared with methodical regularity, always at dawn, always positioned with the same careful attention to placement. A squirrel followed the cardinal, then a rabbit, each laid out like sacrifices at a primitive altar. The escalation wasn't limited to morning offerings. The nighttime encounters intensified, acquiring patterns that suggested increasing boldness. The footsteps that had once shadowed us from a distance now moved closer to the trail during our evening walks. Breaking branches and rustling leaves crafted a symphony of calculated presence, always just out of sight but unmistakably intentional. Friends who visited reported similar experiences. A college roommate, staying for a weekend, described being paced through the woods by something that anticipated his every turn. "It knows these paths better than any human," he observed, his urban confidence shaken by the encounter. He left early, claiming urgent business in Baltimore. The weasel's appearance marked a turning point. Its body showed signs of skilled preparation, cleaned and arranged with almost ceremonial precision. This was followed by larger prey, woodchucks, possums, each displaying increasingly sophisticated handling. Our unseen companion was either growing more ambitious or more desperate to communicate. The elderly couple down the lane began locking their doors at night, something they claimed they'd never done in 30 years of mountain living. They spoke in hushed tones about changes in the forest's character, new sounds echoing through the valleys, strange shadows moving against the natural flow of darkness. My daily routines adapted to accommodate this new reality. I began studying the forest with academic intensity, documenting patterns in the gifts, mapping locations of encountered campsites, noting changes in our observers' behavior. The municipal forest transformed into a vast classroom where I was both student and unwitting participant in some primal experiment. The isolation that had initially drawn me to the cabin took on new dimensions. My grief for my father became entangled with a growing awareness that something profound was unfolding in these woods. The presence that watched us seemed to understand loss, loneliness, the raw edges of human pain. Its attempts at connection, however disturbing, carried an undercurrent of desperate empathy. Winter began its slow retreat, but the warming air brought no relief from our situation. Instead, the lengthening days seemed to energize our unseen companion. The gifts grew more elaborate, the nighttime activities more complex. Each morning brought new evidence of its evolving fixation, arranged branches, crude symbols pressed into the earth, increasingly sophisticated presentations of its offerings. Dog's behavior shifted subtly during this period. Her initial acceptance of the presence gave way to a nervous vigilance. She spent hours staring into the shadows beneath the trees, tracking something my human senses couldn't detect. Her sleep grew restless, punctuated by low whimpers that seemed to respond to sounds beyond my hearing. One particularly cold night, I woke to absolute silence. Even the usual settling sounds of the cabin had ceased, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Through my bedroom window, I could see the spotlight's harsh circle on the front yard, empty except for shadows that seemed to move against the wind. Dog stood at attention by the front door, her entire body rigid with tension. Then came the sound, careful footsteps on the porch, followed by the gentle testing of the door handle. Dog, usually vocal at any disturbance, remained eerily silent, trembling but making no sound as something moved methodically around the perimeter of our shelter. I reached for the spotlight switch, my hand hovering over it as I wrestled with a decision that could shatter the fragile equilibrium of our situation. The footsteps continued their inspection, accompanied now by a soft scratching at the windows, not threatening but exploratory, like a child testing the boundaries of a new discovery. That night marked the beginning of the final phase of our strange communion with the unknown. The barrier between observer and observed was dissolving, and with it would go the last pretense of normal existence in our mountain refuge. The gifts were about to become more personal, more challenging to our understanding of reality, and ultimately more revealing of the tragic truth hidden in the depths of those Maryland woods. Spring's arrival brought an escalation that shattered any remaining illusions of normalcy. The morning offerings transformed from small wildlife to things that spoke of greater violence. Segments of larger animals appeared, raw and primitive in their presentation. The first horse leg, massive and carefully skinned, marked a threshold I hadn't known existed. The precision of the butchery suggested skills learned through necessity rather than training. Clean cuts made with sharp implements, muscle and tissue separated with methodical care. The second leg appeared 2 days later, its preparation even more refined. These weren't random acts of violence. They represented communication, escalating attempts to demonstrate capability or perhaps worth. The forest had changed around us. Areas that once felt welcoming now carried an electric charge of anticipation. The municipal forest's vastness no longer offered comfort, but instead suggested infinite hiding places, countless vantage points from which we could be observed. Even the state park trails seemed to have developed new shadows, deeper and more purposeful than natural darkness. Dog's transformation was subtle at first. Her attention shifted from regular patterns of play and rest to constant vigilance. She would stand at the windows for hours, tracking movement I couldn't see, her body tense with recognition. The confident companion of winter had become a nervous sentinel, aware of changes I was only beginning to understand. The night she left remains etched in my memory with painful clarity. It began with her unusual stillness at dinner, her food untouched as she stared into the gathering darkness beyond our windows. Around midnight, a sound unlike anything I'd heard before filtered through the trees, not quite human, not entirely animal, but something that existed in the spaces between classification. Dog's reaction was immediate and final. She scratched at the door with frantic intensity until I opened it, then bolted into the darkness. Her howls echoed through the forest as she followed something I couldn't see, each cry more distant than the last until silence reclaimed the night. Despite days of searching, calling until my voice gave out, she never returned. The empty cabin felt like a tomb. Every creak and settling noise carried new weight. Each shadow suggested possibility. The gifts continued to appear, but their meaning had shifted. What once felt like attempts at connection now seemed tinged with desperation or threat. The skinned legs of large animals began to feel less like offerings and more like demonstrations of power. My research into local history took on new urgency. The Frederick News Post archives revealed scattered reports of similar incidents. Strange sightings, unexplained phenomena, stories of shadows that moved against natural law. But it was the article about the Sykesville monster that finally connected the fragments into a coherent picture. The description matched perfectly: a bipedal figure, remarkably human in its movements but wrong in its proportions, selecting specific locations or individuals for sustained attention. The pattern of escalating interaction, the gifts, the gradual increase in bold behavior, all of it aligned with other accounts from across the region. Springfield Hospital Center lay just 20 miles east, its sprawling grounds housing hundreds of patients in various stages of treatment. In that era, the line between institutionalization and freedom was often blurry. Patients would sometimes simply walk away, disappearing into the vast woodlands that still dominated western Maryland. The realization brought neither fear nor relief, but rather a profound sadness. A mysterious observer wasn't some cryptozoological wonder or supernatural entity, but something far more tragic. A human mind fractured by circumstance or chemistry, seeking connection in the only ways it understood. The knowledge reshaped my perception of every interaction. The camps I'd discovered took on new meaning. Not just temporary shelters, but evidence of survival skills honed through desperate necessity. Someone who understood enough about living rough to survive Maryland winters, yet retained enough awareness to attempt human connection. However distorted, the psychological hospitals of that era were warehouses of human suffering. Patients deemed too challenging for family care, but not dangerous enough for maximum security, existed in a liminal space. Some found freedom in the surrounding wilderness, trading institutional walls for forest canopy, medication schedules for natural rhythms. My remaining weeks at the cabin took on a different quality. The presence remained constant, but my understanding of it had transformed. Each gift, no matter how disturbing, represented an attempt at social connection by someone who had lost the ability to interact normally. The escalation in size and complexity of offerings suggested increasing desperation, perhaps sensing my impending departure. The final week brought the most dramatic displays. Larger animals appeared, comprehensively butchered, arranged with almost artistic attention to detail. The nighttime activities intensified. More frequent visits to the porch, longer periods of observation through windows, bolder attempts to make presence known. I began leaving my own offerings, sealed containers of food, warm clothing I could spare, basic medical supplies. These would disappear overnight, replaced sometimes with crude arrangements of twigs or stones that might have been attempts at reciprocation. The exchange felt like establishing terms with something that had forgotten the language of normal human interaction. The elderly couple down the lane shared stories they'd previously withheld, tales of other residents who'd experienced similar visitations over the years. Some had fled immediately, others had attempted to maintain boundaries through increasingly desperate measures. None had stayed long enough to understand the true nature of their situation. My decision to leave wasn't driven by fear, but by the recognition that I couldn't offer the kind of help needed. The person in the woods required professional intervention, yet attempting to facilitate that might destroy the fragile freedom they'd carved out for themselves. The ethical complexity of the situation weighed heavily. The final night in the cabin stretched endless. Something circled the building until dawn, its movements conveying an almost childlike distress. The sounds it made weren't quite crying, but carried emotional weight that transcended normal human expression. By morning, the front yard was littered with every type of offering I'd received, a desperate display of everything it had to give. I left most of my non-essential supplies, food, clothing, basic tools. A final gift to someone who had, in their own disturbed way, helped me process my grief and disconnection through months of winter isolation. The drive away felt like abandoning someone in need, though rationally I knew any real help was beyond my capacity to provide. The return to suburban Maryland brought culture shock. The ordered streets and manicured lawns seemed artificial after months in the forest. I found work, rebuilt social connections, moved forward with life. But the experience lingered, coloring my understanding of human nature and the thin membrane between sanity and its absence. Years later, development would swallow much of western Maryland's wilderness. The explosion of housing developments and shopping centers pushed the shadows back, leaving fewer places for lost souls to find refuge. The deinstitutionalization movement of the 1980s would release many patients into communities ill-prepared to support them, leading to the homeless crisis we still grapple with today. Sometimes I wonder about the fate of my forest observer. The survival skills they demonstrated might have sustained them for years, but time and progress consume all mysteries eventually. The Maryland woods hold their secrets closely, but civilization's advance is relentless. Looking back now, at 72, I understand that winter as a crucible of transformation. My observer and I were both running from different kinds of pain, mine from loss and grief, theirs from whatever trauma had fractured their connection to normal society. In our parallel isolation, we found a strange kind of healing, though only one of us had the luxury of choosing when to end the experiment. The Sykesville monster remains a local legend, periodically resurfacing in newspaper articles and campfire stories. But I remember it differently. Not as a creature of fear, but as a lost human being who had found a way to exist in the spaces between civilization and wilderness, reaching out for connection in the only ways they remembered how. That time in the cabin taught me that the line between sanity and madness is more permeable than we like to admit. In the deep woods of western Maryland, I learned that monsters are often just people who've lost their way back to normal human interaction. Sometimes in the darkest hours of night, I still hear phantom footsteps on creaking boards and wonder who might be walking the forests now, leaving gifts for new residents who don't yet understand the tragic story behind their offerings. Life has a different rhythm in southern Mississippi. Time moves like molasses here, sweet and slow, marked not by the tick of clocks, but by the changing of seasons and the cycles of nature. I learned this early, growing up on our family's 246 acres of dense forest land, where the only neighbors were the whispering pines and ancient oaks that had stood sentinel since before my great-grandfather's time. Our town was little more than a crossroads, with a courthouse square and a handful of businesses that seemed frozen in time. The Piggly Wiggly, where Mama bought our groceries, old Mr. Johnson's hardware store with its creaking wooden floors, and Miss Betty's diner where hunters gathered before dawn during deer season. Everyone knew everyone else, and most folks had been there for generations, their stories as intertwined as the kudzu that climbed the trees along the highway. The year was 1993, and at 6 years old, I was already developing a reputation as an odd child. While other kids my age were obsessed with cartoons and playing Nintendo, I spent my days studying animal tracks and memorizing the calls of different birds. Our house sat at the end of a long dirt road, a weathered two-story structure with a wraparound porch that had witnessed more sunsets than anyone could count. My father taught science at the high school in town, but his real passion was the land. He knew every inch of our property, where the creek ran shallow enough to cross in summer, which trees produced the sweetest muscadines in late August, and where the deer preferred to bed down during the heat of the day. He'd been teaching me these things since I could walk, showing me how to move quietly through the underbrush and read the stories written in mud and fallen leaves. The property had come into our family during the Great Depression, when my great-grandfather traded a truck and 2 cows for what others saw as worthless timberland. Over the years, it had provided everything from firewood to food, but more importantly, it had given us a connection to something older and deeper than ourselves. The forest wasn't just trees and dirt. It was alive, breathing, watching. That fall had been unusual from the start. September brought no relief from the summer heat, and October passed with barely a hint of frost. The leaves, usually eager to show their autumn colors, held stubbornly to their green. Even the animals seemed unsettled. The usual patterns of wildlife, as familiar to me as the route to my bedroom, had shifted subtly. Deer were scarce near the house, despite the apple trees that normally drew them in dozens. The songbirds that frequented our feeders grew quiet, and even our old hound Buck spent more time on the porch than pursuing his usual investigations of the property's boundaries. My father noticed these changes too, though he spoke of them only in the offhand way of someone who's lived close to the land long enough to know that nature keeps its own counsel. "Weather's got them spooked," he'd say, "or they're just waiting on the cold to push through." But I'd catch him standing at the edge of the yard sometimes, studying the tree line with an intensity that suggested he felt the strangeness too. November arrived with a sudden cold snap that painted the forest in spectacular colors, virtually overnight. The trees that had been green just days before now blazed with reds and golds, so vibrant they seemed almost artificial. The change brought with it a surge of activity in town as everyone prepared for deer season. Pickup trucks with gun racks appeared in every parking lot, and the hardware store couldn't keep ammunition on the shelves. In our house, preparation for deer season was almost ritualistic. Each evening after dinner, my father would clean his rifles at the kitchen table, while I sat nearby, supposedly doing homework, but actually watching his careful movements and listening to his stories. He had different guns for different purposes. The 30-06 for deer, the 22 for small game, the shotgun for turkey, and he treated each one with reverence. The weekend before opening day, we spent hours checking the tree stands scattered across our property. There were 5 in total, each built to my father's exacting specifications, but his favorite was the one at the southeastern corner where our land met an old logging road. It was 15 feet up in a massive oak tree, with a platform big enough for 2 people, and seats he'd salvaged from an old Ford pickup. From this perch, you could see clear across a natural clearing where deer often crossed between feeding and bedding areas. I, Loved that stand more than the others because it was the only one with enough room for me to bring my books. While Daddy watched for deer, I could lose myself in field guides and wildlife encyclopedias, occasionally looking up to watch squirrels chase each other through the branches or listen to woodpeckers drumming on nearby trees. The height gave me a different perspective on the forest, letting me see how all the pieces fit together. The trails animals made, the way the canopy moved in the wind, the patterns of shadow and light on the forest floor. The day everything changed started like any other during deer season. I woke to the sound of my father's footsteps in the hallway, a gentle tap on my door, and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. The air held that peculiar crispness that comes just before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath waiting for the sun. Mama had laid out my clothes the night before, thermal underwear, heavy jeans, 3 layers of shirts topped with my orange safety vest. I dressed quickly, grabbed my current favorite book, Peterson's Field Guide to North American Mammals, and headed downstairs. The kitchen was warm and bright, a sharp contrast to the darkness pressing against the windows. Mama had made biscuits and gravy, but I was too excited to eat more than a few bites. My father sat at the table, studying weather reports and sipping coffee. He wore his lucky hunting jacket, the one with patches on the elbows and a tear in the right pocket that Mama had sewn up countless times. His rifle stood in the corner, cleaned and oiled the night before, waiting like a faithful dog. We left while the stars were still visible, our breath forming clouds in the beam of Daddy's flashlight. The walk to the stand was familiar. Past the old barn, through the gap in the fence where deer had worn a path, across the creek on stepping stones I could have found blindfolded. The forest was awakening around us, a barred owl making its final calls before sleep, early birds starting their dawn chorus, small creatures rustling in the leaf litter. The air felt different that morning. There was a heaviness to it that had nothing to do with humidity, a stillness that seemed to muffle our footsteps more than usual. Even the pre-dawn sounds seemed subdued, as if the forest itself was holding back, waiting for something. We reached the stand just as the eastern sky began to lighten. The climb up was routine. Daddy first with his rifle slung across his back, then me with my book tucked securely in my jacket. The metal rungs were cold through my gloves, and frost had formed on the platform overnight, making it slick until we brushed it away. The next few hours passed in comfortable silence. I alternated between reading about wolves and watching the forest wake up. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating patches of gold on the forest floor. Squirrels emerged to search for acorns, and a family of raccoons made their way home after a night of foraging. Daddy sat motionless, his rifle across his lap, scanning the clearing with the patience of someone who spent countless hours doing exactly this. The sun had risen fully and was now beginning its slow arc toward afternoon. The temperature had climbed enough that I'd unzipped my jacket, though I could still see my breath when I exhaled. The forest had settled into its daytime rhythm, birds calling, leaves rustling, the occasional snap of a twig as something moved through the underbrush. The sun cast long shadows across the clearing when it happened. I was deep in a chapter about timber wolves when the crack of Daddy's rifle shattered the afternoon quiet. The sound echoed through the trees, sending a flock of crows bursting skyward in protest. My book nearly slipped from my hands as I jumped, startled despite having heard countless shots before. "I just got a buck," Daddy whispered, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His eyes stayed fixed on a point near the edge of the clearing. I followed his gaze, but saw only disturbed underbrush where the deer had stood moments before. I'd been so absorbed in my reading that I'd missed its approach entirely. 10 points at least, he continued, his voice still low. Came out from behind those young pines nice and slow. He described how the buck had stepped cautiously into the clearing, its head high and alert, antlers catching the late afternoon sun. It was the kind of deer hunters dream about, he said, though I was already thinking ahead to the tracking. We waited in the stand, following the protocol Daddy had taught me. Give the deer time, he always said. Let it bed down. A rushed tracker often loses their quarry. The forest gradually resumed its normal sounds. Birds returning, squirrels chattering their complaints about the interruption. After 15 minutes that felt like hours, we began our descent. The metal rungs of the ladder had grown cold again as the sun dropped lower. When my boots touched the ground, the leaves crackled with frost, despite the relatively mild day. Daddy led the way to where the deer had been standing when he shot. The blood trail was easy to spot, bright red drops on brown leaves and green grass, leading toward a thicker part of the forest. But the light was fading faster than usual under the dense canopy. Long shadows stretched between the trees like grasping fingers, and the temperature seemed to drop with each step we took. We should head back for flashlights, Daddy said, marking the last visible blood spot with a strip of orange surveyor's tape. It'll be dark before we can track it far, and I don't like how these clouds are moving in. I looked up through the branches. The clear afternoon sky had given way to a layer of low, grey clouds that seemed to appear from nowhere. They moved quickly, driven by a high wind we couldn't feel down on the forest floor. Something about their speed and color made me uneasy, though I couldn't have said why. The walk back to the house felt longer than usual. The forest had changed as dusk approached. Familiar landmarks looked different in the failing light, and sounds seemed to carry differently through the cooling air. Twice I could have sworn I heard something large moving parallel to our path, but when we stopped to listen, there was only silence. At the house, Mama was starting dinner, the smell of frying chicken drifting from the kitchen. We grabbed our heavy-duty flashlights, the kind with long-lasting batteries and beams that could cut through the densest brush. Daddy added a coil of rope to his pack, anticipating the need to drag out our quarry. Though she didn't say it, I could tell Mama wasn't happy about us heading back out so close to dark. We won't be long, Daddy assured her, though we both knew tracking could take hours. Just going to find where it bedded down and mark the spot for morning if we need to. The forest had transformed during our brief absence. The premature darkness beneath the canopy seemed almost solid now, pushing against our flashlight beams like something alive. The orange surveyor's tape glowed eerily in our lights, marking where we'd left off. The blood trail was even more visible now, stark red against the darkened ground. We followed it deeper into the woods, where the trees grew closer together and the undergrowth thickened. The pleasant forest of the afternoon had become something primordial. Every shadow seemed to hold movement, and familiar sounds took on new meaning in the darkness. The beam of my flashlight caught spider webs strung between branches, their strands glinting like silver wire. The blood trail led us to a section of forest so dense we had to crawl on hands and knees. The undergrowth was a tangled mass of thorns and saplings, forming tunnels barely large enough to pass through. The ground here was different, softer, almost spongy, and marked with depressions I'd never noticed in daylight. We'll split up here, Daddy said, pointing to where the trail seemed to fork. You take the right path. Looks like there's more blood that way. I'll check these drag marks to the left. Stay within shouting distance. We'd done this before many times. It was standard practice when tracking, covering more ground by separating slightly. But something felt wrong this time. The air had grown thick and still, carrying a musty scent I didn't recognize. Even the normal night sounds of the forest had fallen away, leaving only our breathing and the soft crunch of leaves under our feet. I was about 50 yards from Daddy, his flashlight beam visible through the trees when I found it. At the base of an ancient oak tree, partially hidden by ferns, lay a shoulder bone. Fresh blood still coated it, along with fragments of tissue that gleamed wetly in my light. My initial excitement at finding a clue quickly turned to confusion. This wasn't right. Bullet wounds don't tear bones from flesh like this. As I crouched there, studying the bone, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard it. A sharp crack like a baseball bat splitting, followed by absolute silence. Even the wind in the trees seemed to stop. My body tensed instinctively, every lesson about predators and danger flooding back at once. Slowly, fighting against every instinct screaming at me to run, I raised my flashlight toward the sound. The beam shook with my trembling hands, casting jumping shadows through the trees. And then it found something that shouldn't exist. The creature stood 11 feet tall at least, its head nearly brushing the low-hanging branches. Its skin was a uniform grey, like weather-beaten wood, but with a texture that seemed to shift and flow in my flickering light. It walked upright, but everything about its proportions was wrong. The arms hung too low, nearly touching the ground, ending in fingers that were too long and too sharp to be called either hands or claws. It was dragging something the buck daddy had shot. But the deer's body was crushed and twisted, mangled in ways that no bullet could cause. It looked like a child's toy that had been squeezed by an angry giant. I couldn't see the creature's face clearly, and some part of my mind thanked God for that mercy. What I did see was enough. The impossible fluidity of its movement, the wrongness of its joints, the complete silence with which it moved despite its massive size. Terror froze me in place. My flashlight beam trembled violently as hot tears ran down my cheeks. I squeezed my eyes shut, unable to process what I was seeing. The sound of blood rushing in my ears was deafening. When I finally found the courage to look again, the thing was gone. The only evidence of its passing was a trail of blood leading deeper into the darkest part of the forest, where even our powerful flashlights couldn't penetrate. I don't know how long I sat there, crying silently at the base of that tree. Time lost all meaning until I heard Daddy calling my name, his voice tight with worry. He found me still sitting there, unable to speak, my flashlight beam fixed on empty shadows. He didn't ask any questions. Maybe he saw something in my face that told him not to. He just picked me up, though I was too big to be carried, and held me close as we made our way back to where he'd parked the four-wheeler. The ride home was a blur. I clung to him, face buried in his hunting jacket, flinching at every sound from the surrounding darkness. That night, as we sat at the dinner table, Mama asked if we'd found the deer. Daddy just shook his head and changed the subject. He never mentioned going back to look for it in the morning, and I never asked. Some things are better left alone in the deep woods, where ancient trees keep their secrets and shadows hold more than just darkness. We still hunt those woods, but never past sunset. And if sometimes we hear strange sounds in the gathering dark, or find unexplainable tracks in the soft earth, we don't talk about it. The forest keeps its mysteries, and we've learned to respect its boundaries. After all, not everything that walks in the Mississippi woods needs to be understood. Some things just need to be remembered and avoided. Growing up in small-town Mississippi, camping trips were as natural as breathing. By 2019, I'd been on countless excursions into the wilderness, each one blending into the next like watercolors in the rain. But that trip in late June, that one stands apart in my memory with edges sharp enough to cut. I'd known Ava since we were kids, sharing crayons in Mrs. Thompson's third-grade class. She was the kind of friend who could finish your sentences and knew exactly how you liked your coffee, black with 2 sugars in my case. By our mid-20s, we'd settled into different lives. Me working at the local newspaper, her teaching 2nd grade at the elementary school, but we still made time for our adventures. The idea for this particular camping trip came during one of our weekly coffee meetups at Rosemary's Diner, where the coffee was mediocre but the pie made up for it. Ava had been dealing with a rough patch at work, and I'd just finished a demanding series of articles about local politics. We needed an escape. Remember that clearing Tommy mentioned? Ava had asked, fork hovering over her apple pie. Tommy was her cousin, an avid hunter who knew every trail within 50 miles. He said it's perfect for camping, far enough to feel remote, but not so far you need to worry about bears. The clearing was about 3 hours from our hometown, nestled in a forest that straddled the state line. We spent weeks planning the trip, making lists and checking equipment. Ava was always the organized one. She had spreadsheets for everything, including a meal plan that accounted for every snack and drink we might want. I borrowed my brother's truck for the journey, since my sedan wasn't suited for the dirt roads we'd need to navigate. We left early that morning, the sun just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The drive itself was part of the adventure, watching the landscape change from familiar small towns to increasingly wild territory, singing along to playlist Ava had carefully curated for the trip. The last hour of the drive took us down progressively narrower roads, following Tommy's hand-drawn map. The forest pressed in close on both sides, branches occasionally scraping against the truck's sides like curious fingers. The air grew noticeably cooler as we drove deeper into the woods, and the quality of light changed, becoming greener, more filtered. We found the clearing around 3 in the afternoon. It was larger than we'd expected, roughly circular and carpeted with thick grass. Old growth trees surrounded it like silent guardians, their branches creating a natural ceiling high above. A small stream trickled nearby. We could hear it, but not see it through the undergrowth. "This is perfect," Ava declared as we started unloading the truck. She had a system for everything, laying out our gear in neat piles before we began setting up camp. The tent was new, a 4-person dome that gave us plenty of space for our belongings. We'd practiced setting it up in my backyard the weekend before, so the assembly went smoothly. As we arranged the campsite, we worked with the efficient rhythm of longtime friends. We set up the portable camping table my father had given me for Christmas, unfolded our chairs, and organized our cooking supplies. Ava had packed everything in clear plastic bins, each labeled with her neat handwriting: kitchen, food, first aid, and miscellaneous. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. Birds called from the surrounding trees, their songs unfamiliar to our town-trained ears. The air held the clean scent of pine and recent rain, though the ground was dry enough for comfort. "Think we should gather firewood before it gets dark?" I suggested, watching the shadows lengthen across our clearing. Ava nodded, pulling her long dark hair into a practical ponytail. We spent the next hour collecting fallen branches and smaller twigs for kindling, staying within sight of our campsite. The forest floor was rich with dead wood, and we soon had a respectable pile. Ava arranged it carefully near our designated fire pit, a natural depression in the ground that previous campers had ringed with stones. By 6 o'clock, the sun was beginning its descent, and we had everything arranged to Ava's exacting standards. The tent stood sturdy and inviting, our sleeping bags already laid out inside. Our supplies were organized under a tarp strung between trees, protection against possible rain. The makeshift kitchen area was ready for dinner preparation. Starting the fire became our next priority as the daylight began to fade. I'd always been better at this part, having learned the technique from years of backyard barbecues with my dad. Soon, we had a cheerful blaze going, its warmth welcome as the evening air grew cooler. Dinner was simple but satisfying. Hot dogs roasted over the fire on long metal skewers, accompanied by chips and the special trail mix Ava always made for our outings. The fire cast a warm glow across our faces as we talked, catching up on the smaller details of our lives that sometimes got lost in our busy schedules. "Remember that camping trip in high school?" Ava asked, carefully rotating her hot dog over the flames. "When Jessica brought that portable radio and it attracted every mosquito in 3 counties. I laughed, the memory vivid. And Mr. Peterson kept telling us ghost stories until Sarah started crying. We shared more stories as the sky darkened above the clearing. The forest around us grew louder with night sounds. Crickets starting their evening chorus, the occasional hoot of an owl, small creatures rustling in the underbrush. After dinner, we broke out the marshmallows, competing to see who could achieve the perfect golden brown without letting them catch fire. Time seemed to slow down, as it often does around campfires. We talked about everything and nothing, Ava's second graders and their endless energy, my latest articles for the paper, her brother's upcoming wedding, my mom's new hobby of urban beekeeping. The fire crackled companionably, sending sparks dancing upward to join the emerging stars. Around 10, exhaustion from the day's activities began to catch up with us. We carefully extinguished the fire, making sure every ember was dead before heading to the tent. The night had grown cool enough that we were grateful for our warm sleeping bags. "Don't let the Wendigos bite," Ava joked as she settled in, referencing one of Mr. Peterson's old camping stories. We both laughed, though the sound seemed somehow smaller in the darkness of the tent. Sleep came easily, wrapped in the familiar sounds of the forest night and Ava's steady breathing beside me. I drifted off, thinking about how peaceful it was here, so far from the constant noise of town. The clatter that woke me was so out of place, it took my brain several seconds to process it. A metallic crashing sound, like someone had upended our entire kitchen setup. My phone showed 2:17 a.m. when I checked it. Ava slept on beside me, true to form. She'd once slept through a tornado warning back in college. My first thought was rational, probably a raccoon or maybe a deer investigating our campsite for food. We'd stored everything in sealed containers, but animals were often persistent. I moved toward the tent's entrance, intending to scare off whatever it was. That's when I heard it, a sound that had no place in nature, like metal screaming against metal, or tires fighting for grip on wet pavement, but somehow worse. It started low and built to a pitch that made my teeth ache. I froze, hand halfway to the tent's zipper. The rational part of my mind shut down. Every instinct screamed danger, but curiosity, that deadly human trait, made me reach for the zipper again. Moving with deliberate slowness, I opened it just enough to peer out into the darkness. The clearing looked different in the moonlight. Shadows had substance, and familiar shapes became alien and threatening. Our chairs were still visible near the dead fire pit, and beyond them, what I saw, standing there, defied explanation. It was tall, impossibly tall, balanced on two legs that seemed too thin to support its bulk. The creature's body was covered in fur so black it seemed to absorb the moonlight. But it was the head that made my blood run cold. At first glance, it resembled a deer's, but there was something fundamentally wrong about it. The proportions were skewed, like a child's drawing brought to terrible life. Before I could process more details, the creature let out another of those terrible screams. The sound hit me like a physical force, driving me backward into the tent. I scrambled to zip the opening closed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the zipper. Beside me, Ava was finally awake, her eyes wide with confusion and fear in the dim light of my dropped phone. Before she could speak, the creature screamed again, closer this time. We huddled together in our sleeping bags, listening to it move around our campsite. The sounds it made as it investigated our belongings were almost curious, if curiosity could be terrifying. Time lost all meaning. We lay there barely breathing as the thing circled our tent. Sometimes it would go quiet for so long we thought it might have left, only to let out another of those soul-crushing screams just when we'd begun to hope. The first hint of dawn found us still awake, clinging to each other like children. The night sounds had begun to fade, replaced by early morning birdsong. When we finally heard nothing but normal forest noises for over an hour, we dared to move. We packed with frantic efficiency, barely speaking. Everything went into the truck haphazardly, a far cry from Ava's usual organizational systems. Neither of us looked too closely at the ground around our campsite, though I couldn't help noticing deep impressions in the earth that hadn't been there the day before. The drive home was silent, except for the radio, which we kept at a volume just shy of too loud. Ava stared out the passenger window, her hands clenched in her lap. I focused on the road with an intensity that made my eyes hurt, pushing the truck as fast as I dared on the winding forest roads. We never talked about what we heard in those woods. Ava threw away her camping gear when she got home. I still have mine, gathering dust in my garage. Sometimes, on late nights, when sleep won't come, I find myself thinking about that sound, that terrible mechanical scream that had no place in nature. And I wonder what else might be out there, walking in the dark places between the trees. Tommy later mentioned that other hunters had strange stories about that part of the forest, but no one ever stayed long enough to investigate. Maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some places are better left unexplored. As for me and Ava, we still get together for coffee at Rosemary's Diner, but we plan our adventures differently now. There are plenty of ways to escape the everyday that don't involve venturing into the deep woods. And if sometimes we catch each other looking nervously at the tree line when darkness falls, well, that's just something we've learned to live with.